It's 1996 in Atlanta, Georgia, and the capital of the New South is thriving.
Atlanta was in the process of huge economic growth and development. It was the place to be.
For years, the city has been a mecca for young, talented African Americans. And 41-year-old software CEO and millionaire Lance Herndon is the superstar of this booming galaxy.
Lance Herndon founded Access Inc., which grew to be the largest computer consulting firm in the Southeast, owned by an African American.
Recently divorced with a young son, the dashing businessman loves the finer things in life. But his greatest passion is beautiful women.
Lance tended to like fair-skinned African-American women, and that was his thing. Obviously, he dated as many as he could.
But from among the bevy of Atlanta beauties, there is one he keeps going back to. Her name is Lacey.
Long before Lance had become Lance Herndon, the millionaire socialite, he met Lacey, and they developed a real deep friendship. So off and on, they had an affair. I think he just had a real affection for Lacey. A lot of the women were, frankly, jealous of that relationship.
Lacey's been with Lance long enough to know he's a player. But the pair have an unspoken agreement.
I think Lacey, perhaps, was one of the few women that knew of his involvement with other women.
She understood that he dated around, but she liked being number one.
Lance cares deeply for the one woman who's a regular in his life, but he isn't ready to settle down just yet. On April 12, 1996, Lance has a lavish birthday party and meets someone who is going to turn his world upside down. As the evening wears on, the birthday boy is approached by a striking young woman.
Hello.
She is 28-year-old Dion Ball.
Hi, I'm Lance. Cheers.
Dion is a very light-skinned African-American. She's petite. She's attractive.
She's striking. She's fair. Lance is, he's very attracted to a certain kind of woman, and she fits that. And so a chemistry develops between the two.
Lance doesn't know it, but the beautiful woman now chatting him up has gone to great lengths to be by his side tonight.
Dion worked for someone who received an invitation, and so she used that as an opportunity to make a call and snag one for herself. She did not just go to the party on happenstance. There was something at that party that she wanted to get close to.
Right now, Lance couldn't care less how Dion got into the party. All that matters is that she's there.
I'm sure you can. So how long are you in town for?
I live here, actually.
Oh, really?
Indefinitely.
Lance was talking about Dion that first night because she really made an impression on him.
But the Playboy millionaire isn't the only one who's taken notice of the gorgeous Jamaican woman.
It was such a big party that a lot of his lady friends were going to be there that night. Lacey always was sort of behind the scenes and helping him sort of pull off events.
It's not the first time Lacey has seen her on-again, off-again boyfriend with other women. But there's something about this meeting that's different. And it's going to set all three of them on a disastrous collision course. In the days after the party, Lance can't get Dion out of his head, so he quickly arranges to see her again, and she gladly accepts.
Lance and Dion's relationship was fast. I had never heard of her before and heard of her frequently afterwards.
They began going out for lunch and ultimately dinners.
It's clear things are heading in one direction. And sure enough, within days, their unbridled lust becomes impossible to resist.
They became intimate very early on in their relationship.
Lance demands a lot from all the women who come into his bed, but to his delight, Dion is more than happy to satisfy his every desire.
Lance shared with people close to him that the sex between he and Dion was like, she really is blowing my mind.
As long as the word no is not in her vocabulary and she agrees to anything that he wants sexually, she knows that she can stay in his life forever.
Lance is so turned on by Dion that he never stops to ask about her private life. And he should, because there's plenty there to give him pause. Dion's seductive image hides the fact that she's actually a struggling student working hard for a marketing degree.
She had relocated to this country from Jamaica, and she was really fighting to acquire what most people would call the American dream.
And it's not just her modest means that Dion is keeping secret. She's also far from available.
Dion was married to a man named Sean, who was a pilot for Air Jamaica, and he was actually living in Jamaica with their child at the time. You could characterize it as a commuter marriage.
The couple met in the U.S., at which point Dion was a naturalized citizen. And so when Sean returned to the Caribbean, she opted to stay.
So I am going to go and get in the shower.
You do that.
He is thousands of miles away in Jamaica, raising their daughter and working. Sean at this point is focused on trying to hold down the fort until they both get in the same place.
And with Sean spending most of the month back in Jamaica, Dion is free to carry on her affair with Lance without the risk of being found out. And soon, Lance is showering his new lover with gifts, like expensive clothes.
Relatively quickly, she becomes a beneficiary of the largesse of Lance Herndon. He was very generous with Dion, and she was expected to reciprocate with herself in the bedroom.
And just a few weeks into their relationship, Lance takes Dion's breath away with his most lavish gift yet.
Surprise!
Lance drove to his dealership. He walked over to a vehicle. He turned to Dion. He said, "Do you like this one?" She said, "I do." They gave him the keys. He handed them to Dion. She was ecstatic. It was like a dream come true.
The gift confirms Dion's belief that she and Lance have a future together.
He had never provided a car to any of his other women. It really stood out.
The act of generosity certainly doesn't go unnoticed by the other woman in Lance's life, his sometime girlfriend, Lacey. But she's quick to reassure him it doesn't bother her.
Lacey says, "Listen, I don't want the strings attached. I'm okay with the intimacy, and you can do your thing, and I can do my thing, and I'm okay with that."
Lacey had Lance's confidence, and it came from a longer-standing relationship. It was a relationship where the two were available to each other for whatever their needs may be.
But is Lacey as easygoing as she seems? In July of 1996, Dion goes to the airport to pick up Sean for one of his regular visits.
I don't think that Sean had any notion that Dion would start seeing someone else. He was waiting for her to bring the family back together.
Sean has only been gone for a few weeks, but in that time, his wife has been transformed into a new, more glamorous person.
This is my car.
Dion pulled up in this shiny, brand new car that he had never seen before.
I got it for work. My boss gave it to me. I haven't mentioned
And
it.
the first thing he asked her was, where did you get this car? Because when last time I saw you, you were driving a burgundy Honda Accord that was 10 years old.
Dion Baugh is cheating on her husband, Sean, with a charismatic millionaire named Lance. Sean now suspects that his wife has been lying to him and is furious. All three are headed for a huge confrontation, detonating a powder keg of jealousy and murder. Dion Baugh is involved in a no-holds-barred affair with magnetic millionaire Lance Herndon. For the past 2 months, she's kept her husband Sean completely in the dark. But the showy gifts from this passionate relationship are becoming hard to ignore. Sean can't understand how his wife could afford a luxury car, and he presses her for an explanation.
Dion told him that she had acquired a mentor who was going to help her career and that he allowed her to just drive the car because her car had broken down.
Something about the story doesn't sit right, but as Sean pushes further, Dion flies into a rage.
She denied it to the extent that she actually got offended by the fact that he would even question her or suspect her, and she started an argument.
Sean is certain that Dion is up to more than she's letting on, and the bad blood between them suits Dion just fine.
By starting the argument, she was able to keep him at bay for the rest of the weekend so that they did not even have any marital relations while he was here in Atlanta.
Dion rides out the remainder of Sean's visit, but when he returns to Jamaica, she wastes no time in contacting Lance. And days after her husband's departure, Dion is back, savoring the gifts showered upon her by her secret lover.
Dion was enjoying a pretty enviable allowance. Lance was giving her like $500, $700 per week. She loved wearing designer clothes that people couldn't even pronounce.
Really, if you want to think of it as a gold digger on steroids, every little token of appreciation that she gets from Lance to her is a stepping stone to the next level.
By the start of July 1996, Dion is pushing along her relationship with Lance at a breakneck pace. It seems as though Dion is hell-bent on ditching her husband, Sean, and becoming the next Mrs. Lance Herndon.
She had the brass ring in her sights. I think that was the ultimate goal for her.
My God.
But her lover is starting to feel like things are moving too fast.
He was very hesitant because Lance had undergone a very painful divorce recently.
He is wondering, what have I gotten myself into?
It was the most expensive one, but perfection comes at a price, right?
Dion is quick to ease Lance's worries, using the one weapon in her arsenal he can't resist.
She had to use her sexual appeal to get what she wanted. And once she made up her mind to do that, there were simply no bounds to what she would do sexually to get her goal.
But there's a looming problem in Lance's life, and the escapades in the bedroom can only distract him for so long. Nobody else knows it, but the millionaire playboy is broke.
He was spending more money than was coming in, and he was doing it for quite some time.
It's just a temporary overdrawn situation. If you shift the accounts around, it's very...
He was using his lines of credit to offset cash flow, and that, frankly, was a recipe for collapse.
Thank you.
Lance realizes he needs to cut back his astronomical spending habits. And over the past few months, his biggest outlay has been Dion. Dion has no idea that Lance is starting to have doubts about their relationship and can't understand why, suddenly, she can no longer get a hold of him.
Dion called into the office and wanted to talk to Lance, and Lance did not want to talk to her.
But Dion is risking her relationship with her husband and daughter to pursue this affair. And she isn't going to let her golden ticket slip through her fingers this easily.
She did not want to take no for an answer. She was aggressive and demanding.
She doesn't play it cool. She almost becomes like a stalker. She's consumed with his whereabouts. She's calling his office constantly.
Since meeting Lance, Dion has been in overdrive. She sees herself getting closer and closer to the prize when he doesn't want to talk to her at all. This doesn't just upset the apple cart. This is like running a sports car into a brick wall.
Dion comes to an absolute conclusion. She needs to win Lance back, whatever it takes. And on the evening of July 9th, 1996, she pays her lover a visit, unannounced. At this point, Dion is under the impression she's the only woman in Lance's life. But a knock on his front door is about to deliver a rude awakening. On this particular night, Lance has company. One of his favorite girlfriends is with him. Her name is Kathy.
Kathy would command attention in any room that she walked into. She was about 5'8", 5'9", long hair, very attractive.
When there's no answer at the door, Dion peers through the front window of Lance's home.
And through the window was able to see Kathy walking through the house.
This is a typical example of the kind of web that Lance would create for himself, where here he is with a woman inside his home, and he's clearly told her one thing, and yet here's another woman who is banging on his door.
Dion can't believe what she's seeing, and she explodes.
We know that Dion began beating and kicking on the door and trying to get into the house to the extent that Lance called the police.
Dion realizes she's the one being played. Until now, she's stopped at nothing to win Lance's affection. And in spite of what she's just seen, she certainly isn't ready to let him go without a fight. Dion Baugh is having a steamy affair with a rich businessman named Lance. What she doesn't know is that Lance is still sleeping with other women behind her back. And when Dion catches him with his lover, Kathy, the stage is set for an explosive showdown.
Dion began beating and kicking on the door and trying to get into the house. She was very irate.
Kathy is horrified and demands answers from Lance. Does he know this crazy woman trying to smash her way into his house?
He has to provide Kathy with some explanation, which probably went along the lines of, I don't know who she is. There must be some kind of stalker, some kind of nut outside of there.
I have no idea who this is.
Kathy insists Lance do something. And having painted Dion as a potential intruder, he's left with only one option.
You snake!
He's forced to call law enforcement. And so he's keeping up an appearance for Kathy in that situation, and winds up ringing a bell that he can't unring, unfortunately.
The police arrive and arrest Dion, and to her dismay, Lance continues to deny knowing who she is.
Dion was frantic when they arrived. She was angry, abusive to them, and really uncontrollable.
Dion is carted off to jail, leaving Lance to reflect on what's just happened.
I think deep down, he knows it's only going to get worse.
But will his cold-blooded action be enough to get rid of Dion for good? After his complete betrayal, denying he even knows her, Dion must think she's seen the last of her unfaithful lover. But the next day, still in her cell, she gets a surprising visitor, Lance.
he is in fact the one that bailed her out of jail.
The millionaire playboy couldn't admit he's seeing other women in front of Kathy. But now he wants to try and make a bad situation right.
Now he's got to make amends for this action that he set into motion, which was at Dion's expense. And so he agreed to not only bail her out to go pick her up, but also to make sure that the charges would be dismissed.
Lance wants the whole incident to disappear with a minimum of fuss.
Lance was much like most people. They didn't want their dirty laundry aired in public. And this was a very public thing for him.
But unfortunately for Lance and Dion, the damage is already done. Having had Dion arrested for trespassing, Lance is told that she must now answer the charge in court at a later hearing.
But law enforcement wouldn't allow him to, and he was going to have to actually appear at the hearing in order to do so formally.
Outside of the police station, Dion demands that Lance explain why a half-naked woman was wandering around his house.
Later, he tells Dion, well, listen, she was just a friend. She was over taking a shower. There's nothing really going on. We called the police because we thought it was a burglar.
Lance was particularly adept at saying, you know, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?
Eventually, Dion concedes she may have misread the situation, and they agree to a truce. And miraculously, over the next few weeks, the two lovers appear to put the whole episode behind them, bringing back the heat to their affair.
They absolutely continue to be involved even after this incident.
I'm sure he did care about her, and I think probably more than anything, the only reason that he had her arrested was because she wouldn't leave.
But there's still one major obstacle standing between Dion and the life with Lance. Her husband, Sean. He's back on another visit from Jamaica, and even though he's already called his wife out on her expensive new lifestyle, he sees that it's done no good.
Gradually, it's becoming clear to Sean that Dion is sort of morphing into someone that he doesn't know. Every time he sees her, she is living a little more grand.
But Sean is still unsure whether Dion is cheating on him. That is, until the phone rings late one night.
Lance called Dion's home, and Sean picked up. And he said, "Can I speak to Dion?" And Sean said, "Who is this?" And he said, "This is Lance." And he said, "Who is this?" "I am Dion's husband."
Good night.
Sean asks Dion if this is the rich mentor who gave her the car.
When Sean confronts Dion, Dion, of course, maintains that Lance is just a friend.
My house.
But he can't understand why a friend would be calling so late at night.
Well, what's the big deal? The big deal is that this man...
Sean is livid, and he knows that all of the gifts, the car sitting out in the driveway, all of those are connected to the phone call that just came in.
Sean quickly realizes he's not the only man in this marriage.
These situations involving love triangles can be very, very volatile. It's just ripe for an explosive situation to occur, and quite frequently that is exactly what we see.
But an angry husband isn't the only problem Dion has to confront. On August 7th, 1996, Dion and Lance are faced with the alarming prospect of Dion's trespassing trial the next day. Dion needs Lance to take the stand in order for the trespassing charges he filed to be dropped. So she wants confirmation he'll be there.
The idea that she would have Lance allied with her, ready to go to court with her, speak on her behalf, see if they can get the charges dropped, is incredibly important to Dion.
But by that evening, she still hasn't been able to reach him. Desperate, she calls his office one last time. This time, a woman answers.
Hello?
Dion called, and Lacey picked up.
Dion has no idea that the woman on the end of the line is another potential love rival. So she leaves a message. But Lacey knows all about Dion.
So when Lance showed up, Lacey told him Dion called. She seemed a little edgy, and Lance disappeared and went upstairs to make the call privately.
For a brief moment on the evening of August 7th, Lance speaks to one lover while another waits downstairs. Soon, this tortured love triangle will come to a head with deadly repercussions. The next morning, August 8th, is a regular workday at Lance's office, which is located in the basement of his 3-story luxury home. Staff arrive ready to face piles of paperwork left for them by their demanding boss. On any given day, Lance is already toiling away.
Lance was very punctual. If you were 10 seconds late, you were late.
But on this morning, he's nowhere to be seen.
I go into his office, and his computer screen is up, and his calendar is blank. He was the most scheduled person I've ever known. I can't imagine him having a blank day on his calendar. I'm sitting there thinking, well, something's going on.
At first glance, it seems that Lance's normal routines have been abandoned.
The laptop was not in the office, but the case was in the supply closet. Lance would never let that laptop leave without the case.
Concerned for their boss's whereabouts, his assistants call Lance's mother. She arrives a little while later and goes up to her son's private residence in the upper levels of the house.
When she walked into the bedroom, she could tell that there was someone in the bed because she could see the outline.
Lance's mother calls out his name, but when she gets no response, she pulls back the comforter.
I'm sure it's a sight that she'll remember for the rest of her life, because there was her only son laying nude, face up, just savagely beaten to death, and his head in his face.
Lance Herndon has been murdered in cold blood in his own bed from a cast of many lovers and haters. Who would want him dead? "41-year-old Lance Herndon has been involved in passionate affairs with a string of attractive Atlanta women. Now, on August 8th, 1996, his naked, mutilated body has been found in his bed. Police investigators attempt to piece together what happened.
The injuries to Lance are gruesome. The manner of death appears to be some type of blunt force trauma, no less than 14 blows to the head, indicating that whoever perpetrated this crime did so with extreme anger towards Lance.
There was a strong sexual component. He was nude. There was a porn tape on the VCR. There was condoms on the bedstand.
There are no signs of forced entry.
It sent red flags that we're talking about someone who was close to him, that he would have felt comfortable enough disrobing in front of.
Police begin looking for clues. It appears that someone wanted to delay the discovery of the body for as long as possible.
He wanted to make sure that he got up at 4 o'clock in the morning. So he had the clocks positioned in 3 different areas of the bedroom. So he would be forced to get up to turn them off. All of the alarm clocks in his bedroom were unplugged from the wall.
Police also find a picture lying face down on the dresser.
That picture was Kathy. They took note of that.
There is one final gory clue laid out in front of the investigators.
Along the wall and also on the ceiling overhead, there were these spatters of blood. The pattern tended to form a V shape. The location of the V above his head puts the position of the killer on the bed. and actually on his body.
Police speak to Lance's employees to see if there's anyone who might have had a grudge against the millionaire businessman.
Here you have a man who's been found bludgeoned to death in his bed, and you learn early on that there are multiple women who were involved with the victim. He certainly created circumstances where there are several women that could have felt very scorned.
One of the names police are given is Dion Baugh. Detectives go to her house to break it to her that Lance is dead. But somehow, word has already spread.
They walked into her home. They found her sitting on the couch, wailing. She's saying, I just heard what happened to him, and oh my God, I can't believe Lance is dead.
Dion admits to having an affair with Lance and says she'd last seen him the previous evening.
She was very certain about the time. She was writing her paper, and so she's certain that it was in between 9 and 10:30 on the previous night. Lance came to her house and brought her this laptop computer.
Dion still has the machine and hands it over to the officer. After that, she says, Lance quickly left.
He only stayed for a couple of minutes because they got into an argument about Sean, and she asked him to leave.
It's the first police have heard of Dion's husband, Sean, but it raises a red flag.
It was the kind of killing that would have been consistent with the husband involved in a love triangle.
This revelation makes Sean the top suspect in the investigation. But Sean claims that he left Atlanta on a flight bound for Jamaica on the day of Lance's murder.
Sean was looked at very extensively, to the extent that we actually sent people to Jamaica to obtain all his flight information. His flight left a little bit after 8 p.m. that evening, and so it would have been physically impossible for him to have made such a long journey.
With Sean off their list, police now turn to look at Kathy, the young woman whose picture was mysteriously found lying face down on Lance's dresser.
They talked to Kathy and tried to ascertain her whereabouts for the time frame of the murder. She provided them. She also provided them with receipts from where she had gone to dinner that night, who she had been with, who she had talked to.
Kathy's alibi appears to hold up, and she's cleared as a suspect as well. Investigators then turn their attention to the other name given to them by Lance's co-workers, Lacey. But when Lacey arrives for her interview, she isn't alone.
She shows up with an attorney, which sends off some red flags to them.
When police ask her where she was on the night of Lance's murder, they quickly understand why she seems so nervous.
She was at the house the night prior and was the last person to see him alive.
Lacey tells the detectives about her relationship with Lance and about the final hours they spent together. Information that will help officers uncover the shocking truth about what really happened behind Lance Herndon's bedroom door. Police are frantically tracking the killer of Atlanta businessman Lance Herndon. They've already questioned 3 of his lovers. One has an alibi. The remaining 2, Dion and Lacey, both admit they saw the victim on the night he died. Lacey relates that on the evening of the 7th, she was with Lance in his office, having a heart-to-heart talk.
Lance is feeling reflective that night, and he tells Lacey that he's tired of Kathy and Dion, and he's ready to cut both of them loose.
She tells detectives that after their talk, she stayed at the office for a couple of hours while Lance continued to work.
Lacey verified to investigators that she saw that laptop in Lance Herndon's office before she left around 10:30 that night.
Lacey says she spoke to Lance one last time later that evening. Police follow up on Lacey's story and discover she's telling the truth.
Lacey is alibied out because of phone records. We've got a phone call from Lance at home to Lacey at her home after midnight.
Lacey is officially struck off the list of potential suspects. But her version of events does cast doubt over one person, Dion. Earlier, she told police she was certain Lance was with her between 9 and 10:30 p.m.
The time window doesn't add up because Lacey puts Lance in his home around 10 o'clock. It's during that time that Dion says that Lance brings the computer to her home, so someone is not telling the truth.
The phone records suggest Dion is the one lying, and it's backed up by neighbors who claim they saw her distinctive vehicle leaving Lance's house early on the morning of the 8th. However, with no concrete proof, police can't press charges. For the next year, police closely monitor Dion. They're finally rewarded when Sean files for divorce, and she makes a fateful disclosure.
They learned that Dion had confided to her mother-in-law that she had actually gone to Lance's house the night of the murder.
This admission, coupled with a theft of Lance's laptop, the witness statement about her car, and a lack of any other potential suspect, is enough evidence for police. In January 1998, they arrest Dion Baugh. In April 2001, her case goes to trial. The prosecution argues that on the night of August 7th, despite Lance tiring of Dion, he agreed to let her come over to his house.
This may have been the last hurrah, a goodbye, sexual experience, or it could have just been Lance trying to keep her at bay.
But the prosecution contends that Dion went there to make sure Lance planned to drop the trespassing charge against her in court the next day.
She decided to check his calendar because guess what? The calendar held all the truths to what he was planning on doing, and discovered that that was not on the agenda for the next day.
It pushed her over the edge, along with the public embarrassment, along with having to give up all the money, the car, the credit cards, the prestige, everything. You're about to lose it all.
But Dion wasn't ready to let that happen. She climbed back into bed, but sex was the last thing on her mind.
She grabbed a blunt, heavy object, straddled him, and caught him unaware.
He was struck in between 10 and 14 blows to his skull, his face, forehead.
She was driven to literally beat the man to death.
The prosecution cites evidence that Dion's DNA found underneath Lance's fingernails and in his bed is proof she killed him. But the defense disagrees.
All that proves is that Dion at some point had been in that home, in his bed, in his presence. None of this timestamps exactly when they were together, whether it was the night before, whether it was the night of his death. You're dealing with a mostly circumstantial case.
A jury finds Dion guilty, but the verdict is overturned. And the second time around, the case ends in a mistrial. Finally, on the eve of her third trial, Dion enters a plea of voluntary manslaughter and is convicted.
She was a woman who could have been highly successful in another career if she had just put her sights that way. Failure was not an option. So why did she do it? It was rejection, yes, but it was also failure. She couldn't handle that one moment of failure.
Lance Herndon's family and friends are left to mourn the loss of a brilliant man.
Lance had so much potential. It's potential unrealized. Lance left behind a son, now without a father, a mother, now without a son. And no one should have their life taken in such a brutal fashion.
The concept of the American dream is one of the most powerful and enduring promises in modern human history. For decades, it has served as a beacon, projecting an image of boundless opportunity, fair compensation for hard work, and the ultimate protection of individual liberties. It is a narrative that has crossed oceans and continents, reaching the most remote and impoverished corners of the globe. For those living in difficult economic conditions, this dream is not merely an abstract ideal or a distant philosophy, it is viewed as a tangible lifeline, a definitive way to alter the trajectory of their lives and the lives of their families for generations to come. But what happens when this profound hope is weaponized? What happens when the promise of a better life is meticulously manipulated, transforming from a beacon of salvation into a meticulously engineered trap? The story of Daegu Apparel is a harrowing exploration of this exact nightmare. It is a story that forces us to confront the darkest corners of human exploitation, revealing how the very mechanisms designed to offer freedom can be perverted to construct a system of modern slavery. This case, which would ultimately become a landmark in the history of the United States justice system, did not occur in the shadows of an unregulated, lawless nation. It took place on American soil, under the jurisdiction of the United States, yet geographically isolated in a way that allowed an unthinkable atrocity to unfold in plain sight. To understand how a tragedy of this magnitude could occur, one must first understand the unique geographical and political landscape of American Samoa. Situated in the vast expanse of the South Pacific Ocean, American Samoa is a small, remote territory composed of several islands. It is characterized by its stunning natural beauty, tight-knit local communities, and distinct cultural heritage. Politically, it holds a unique status as an unincorporated territory of the United States. This means that while it flies the American flag and is subject to federal laws, it operates with a significant degree of local autonomy and is separated from the United States mainland by thousands of miles of open ocean. This isolation is its defining feature. It is a place that is exceptionally difficult to reach and, crucially, even more difficult to leave for a predator looking for a place to operate outside the immediate, watchful eye of federal authorities while still benefiting from the lucrative economic advantages of being on United States territory. American Samoa presented an unparalleled opportunity. It offered the perfect camouflage, the legal legitimacy of America combined with the profound physical isolation of a remote island. The architect of this exploitation was a Korean businessman named Kil Soo-lee. On paper, Lee was an entrepreneur, the owner of a garment manufacturing company called Daegu Apparel. The garment industry in the late 1990s was fiercely competitive, driven by an insatiable global demand for fast, cheap production. Profit margins were tight, and the pressure to reduce labor costs was constant. Lee, however, did not view labor merely as a cost to be managed. He viewed it as a resource to be entirely subjugated. Recognizing the strategic advantages of American Samoa, he established his manufacturing complex in the region of Tafuna. By locating his factory on a United States territory, the clothing produced at Daegu Apparel could legally bear the coveted Made in USA label. This label was highly sought after by major mainland clothing brands as it allowed them to market their garments at premium prices, bypassing restrictive international import quotas and tariffs. Lee understood that he could secure lucrative contracts with these brands, but only if he could keep his production costs artificially and illegally low. To achieve this, he required a workforce that was not only cheap but entirely compliant, devoid of rights, and completely trapped. To source this captive workforce, Lee turned his attention to the rural, economically disadvantaged regions of Vietnam and China. He understood the psychological landscape of these areas perfectly. He knew that the people living there, primarily young women, were desperate for economic advancement. They were individuals deeply committed to supporting their families, willing to endure immense hardship if it meant securing a better future. Lee capitalized on this desperation by initiating a highly coordinated and deceptive recruitment campaign. He forged contracts with various labor export brokerage firms operating within Vietnam and China. These brokers acted as his emissaries, venturing into rural villages to spread the promise of Daegu Apparel. The pitch was intoxicating and meticulously designed to exploit the specific hopes of the target demographic. The brokers promised these young women stable, consistent employment in a modern, safe manufacturing facility. They promised wages that aligned with the high standards of the United States economy, figures that were astronomically higher than anything these women could hope to earn in their home countries. Most insidiously, they promised that this employment could serve as a legitimate pathway to eventually acquiring United States citizenship. For these women, this was not just a job offer. It was a miraculous opportunity, the literal manifestation of the American dream brought directly to their doorsteps. However, the cost of accessing this dream was deliberately designed to be ruinous. The brokers, acting on behalf of Lee, demanded exorbitant recruitment fees for the privilege of securing a position at Daegu Apparel. Each worker was required to pay a sum ranging from $5,000 to $8,000 United States dollars. In the context of rural Vietnam and China in the years 1998 and 1999, this was not merely a large sum of money, it was an unimaginable fortune. It represented decades of hard labor in their local economies. To raise these funds, the women and their families had to take extreme, life-altering measures. They borrowed heavily from informal lenders at crippling interest rates. They liquidated whatever meager assets they possessed. Most devastatingly, many families were forced to mortgage their small parcels of land and their ancestral homes, placing the entire financial security of their extended families on the shoulders of these young women. This financial mechanism was the first and most crucial stage of the trap. Before the workers had even packed their bags, before they had even set foot on an airplane, they were already deeply ensnared. Lee knew that by saddling them with this astronomical debt, he was stripping them of their agency. They could not simply quit and return home if conditions were poor. Returning home without the promised wages meant absolute financial ruin for their entire families. They were bound to him by the heavy, invisible chains of financial extortion long before the physical chains were ever applied. The journey from their rural villages to the island of American Samoa was fueled by a mixture of profound anxiety and desperate optimism. These women left everything they knew behind, carrying the massive weight of their families' expectations and the terrifying burden of their debt. They crossed the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, believing they were traveling toward a brighter, more secure future. But the illusion was shattered the moment they arrived. As the planes touched down in Tafuna, the true nature of Lee's operation was immediately and brutally revealed. There was no gentle orientation, no welcoming introduction to their new lives. The transition from hopeful recruits to captive laborers was instantaneous and aggressively enforced. Upon arriving at the Daegu Apparel complex, the very first action taken by Lee and his management team was the systematic confiscation of every worker's passport and all forms of personal identification. This act was swift, non-negotiable, and profoundly symbolic. In a foreign territory, surrounded by an unfamiliar ocean, a passport is the only proof of identity and the only legal means of movement. By seizing these documents, Lee effectively erased their legal existence and severed their only remaining ties to the outside world. They were no longer international workers, they were undocumented captives, stranded thousands of miles from home with no means of proving who they were or where they came from. The physical environment of the Tafuna facility instantly mirrored the psychological imprisonment of the debt and the stolen passports. The workers were not brought to comfortable dormitories. They were herded into a heavily fortified compound that more closely resembled a maximum security prison than a manufacturing plant. The entire residential and industrial complex was encased behind high, impenetrable fences topped with thick, sharp barbed wire. The gates were permanently locked and strictly monitored. Kilsuli instituted a system of relentless surveillance, employing a contingent of guards to patrol the perimeter 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The workers were issued a strict, terrifying mandate. Under no circumstances were they permitted to leave the confines of the Daegu Apparel compound. The isolated nature of American Samoa meant there was nowhere to run even if they could breach the barbed wire, but the physical barriers served as a constant, looming reminder of their absolute subjugation. Within the span of a single day, the American dream that had been so carefully sold to them evaporated into the humid Pacific air. The young women from Vietnam and China, who had mortgaged their families' futures for a chance at prosperity, found themselves entirely cut off from the world. They were trapped in a foreign land, drowning in unpayable debt, stripped of their legal identities, and locked behind cold steel and barbed wire. They were utterly at the mercy of Kilsuli, a man who had engineered this elaborate, international deception not to build a business, but to build a modern-day slave camp. The trap had been flawlessly executed, and the gates of the Tafuna compound slammed shut, sealing hundreds of women inside a nightmare from which there seemed to be no possible escape. The stage was now set for a regime of systematic abuse, starvation, and grueling labor that would soon escalate into unimaginable violence. The transition from the intoxicating illusion of the American dream to the devastating reality of absolute captivity was not a gradual descent, but an instantaneous plunge into an unimaginable nightmare. When the young women from the rural provinces of Vietnam and China first stepped onto the sun-baked tarmac of American Samoa, the heavy humidity of the South Pacific immediately enveloped them. Yet it was the profound sense of absolute isolation that truly chilled their blood. They were young, carrying the innocent, hopeful faces of rural youth and the crushing burden of their family's financial survival. Back in their remote home villages, they had been cherished daughters and desperate providers. Within the heavily fortified walls of the Tafuna industrial compound, however, they were systematically reduced to mere extensions of the industrial machinery. Kilsili demanded total, unquestioning submission, and he meticulously designed the environment of Daegu Apparel to crush any residual flicker of hope. The calculated psychological destruction commenced the very moment they set foot in the facility. Management immediately confiscated their passports, locking them away in impenetrable safes. This profound act of erasure severed their legal ties, rendering them undocumented ghosts stranded on a remote island. They were thousands of miles from home, stripped of their identities, and entirely at the mercy of a regime that viewed them as disposable property. The physical environment of the Tafuna facility instantly mirrored the severe psychological imprisonment initiated by the stolen passports. The workers were not brought to the safe dormitories they had been promised by the deceptive labor brokers. Instead, they were herded into a sprawling, heavily fortified industrial complex that more closely resembled a brutal maximum security prison than a legitimate manufacturing plant. The entire residential and factory compound was encased behind high chain-link fences topped with thick, vicious coils of razor wire that glinted menacingly in the tropical sun. The massive iron gates were permanently locked and strictly monitored by a syndicate of aggressive guards who patrolled the perimeter 24 hours a day. These guards operated with absolute impunity under Lee's explicit directives. The isolated nature of American Samoa meant there was nowhere to run even if a desperate worker could somehow breach the fortified barbed wire. The physical barriers served as a constant, looming psychological reminder of their absolute, inescapable subjugation. The factory itself was a cavernous, poorly ventilated warehouse that operated as a relentless crucible of human endurance. Inside, hundreds of heavy industrial sewing machines created a deafening, continuous roar that pounded against the eardrums and drowned out any possibility of conversation or collective organization. There was no air conditioning to combat the oppressive, sweltering tropical heat. The air inside the factory hung thick, stagnant, and heavily choked with microscopic fabric dust that coated the women's lungs, irritated their eyes, and clung to their sweat-drenched skin. In this claustrophobic environment, the workers were forced into grueling, agonizing shifts that stretched from 14 to an unimaginable 18 hours a single day. The fundamental concept of rest was entirely eradicated. They sat violently hunched over their workstations, their eyes straining under the harsh glare of cheap fluorescent lights, their cracked fingers moving with frantic speed to meet impossible production quotas. Every garment they stitched was destined for the pristine shelves of mainland American retail stores, bearing a label that promised ethical labor, while the hidden reality of its creation was steeped in unspeakable suffering. If a worker momentarily slowed her pace or closed her eyes out of sheer exhaustion, she was met with immediate, violent retribution. Floor managers paced the narrow aisles like predatory wardens, screaming vicious insults and brandishing heavy wooden sticks to maintain the terrifying rhythm of the factory. The women were trapped in a perpetual cycle of mechanical repetition. To further ensure their complete physical and mental subjugation, Kilsuli weaponized the most fundamental and desperate human need: basic sustenance. The starvation of the captive workforce was not an accidental consequence of poor management. It was a highly calculated, deliberate, and extraordinarily cruel strategy of physical and psychological warfare. The daily rations provided to the hundreds of exhausted women were grotesquely inadequate, designed specifically to drain their remaining energy and eliminate any physical capacity for resistance. The meager meals consisted almost entirely of plain, undercooked white rice and limp boiled cabbage, served in pitifully small portions that barely coated the lining of their shrinking stomachs. Occasionally, this dismal fare was accompanied by a watery, lukewarm broth that offered zero nutritional value. On the incredibly rare instances when animal protein was provided, it was almost always rotting, spoiled chicken that permeated the sweltering dining hall with a deeply nauseating stench. The women, driven to the brink of insanity by constant hunger, were forced to consume this rancid food simply to survive. The physical consequences of this starvation were immediate and horrifying. Within just a few short months, the vibrant young women were tragically transformed into skeletal, fragile shadows of their former selves. The vast majority experienced a terrifying, rapid weight loss, shedding 10 to 15 kilograms from their already slender frames. Their cheekbones protruded sharply from gaunt faces, their dark eyes grew hollow, and their oversized work uniforms hung loosely from their emaciated shoulders. The chronic malnutrition devastated their immune systems, leaving them highly susceptible to rampant infections. Compounding the intense agony of their physical starvation was the crushing, ever-present psychological terror of their complete financial captivity. The singular reason these women had crossed the vast ocean was to earn money to pull their beloved families out of deep poverty and to meticulously repay the monumental debts incurred to secure their positions at Daegu Apparel. Yet, as the agonizing weeks slowly bled into endless months, the promised American wages absolutely never materialized. Payday was nothing more than a cruel fiction within the fortified walls of the compound. When the exhausted women eventually mustered the desperate courage to plead for the money they had literally bled and starved for, Kilsuli countered with a masterclass in psychological manipulation and financial extortion. He coldly informed the workers that their entire salaries were being aggressively withheld to cover the exorbitant, fabricated costs of their squalid room, their miserable board, and the rotting food they were barely surviving on. Lee had meticulously constructed an inescapable financial labyrinth that mathematically guaranteed the vulnerable women would never earn a single cent during their captivity. The psychological toll was profound. As they sat in the suffocating heat of the factory floor, their fragile bodies aching with fatigue, their minds were endlessly tormented by vivid visions of their vulnerable families back home. They knew with absolute certainty that with every passing day they failed to send money back, the brutal loan sharks in their rural villages were closing in on their parents' small homes. For those few resilient individuals who still possessed a lingering spark of resistance, Dago Apparel harbored even darker mechanisms of absolute control and terror. Any display of defiance, no matter how incredibly minor, was met with catastrophic, overwhelming punishment. A worker who dared to politely complain about the maggot-infested food, who pleaded through tears for a brief moment of rest, or who cried out in the agonizing throes of illness was immediately designated as a severe threat to the authoritarian order. The punishment was a terrifying escalation into pure physical and psychological torture. The sadistic management actively utilized a large industrial shipping container scattered around the rear, unshaded areas of the compound as makeshift solitary confinement cells. These massive, solid steel boxes, completely devoid of ventilation or light, sat directly under the scorching, unrelenting South Pacific sun. When a weeping worker was violently thrown into one of these containers and the heavy steel doors were locked tight behind her, she was instantly thrust into an unimaginable hell. The temperature inside the airtight metal box would quickly skyrocket to lethal levels, creating a literal baking oven. The trapped women would bake in the suffocating darkness, gasping desperately for oxygen as the intense heat drew every ounce of moisture from their dehydrated bodies. They were callously left in these terrifying coffins for excruciating hours, sometimes stretching into agonizing days, provided with absolutely no food or water. When the doors finally opened, the women who emerged were physically broken and deeply traumatized. Yet, the pervasive horrors of Dago Apparel extended far beyond the brutal sweatshop floor and the suffocating confines of the sun-baked isolation boxes. Deep in the dark, unmonitored shadows of the compound, hidden entirely away from the rhythmic clatter of the industrial sewing machines. A far more insidious and profoundly violating form of terror was systematically perpetrated against the most vulnerable of the female captives. The severely unbalanced power dynamic deliberately established by Kill Silly granted his floor managers and security personnel absolute, unchecked authority over the daily lives and the physical bodies of the workers. This environment inevitably and tragically bred extreme, rampant sexual violence. Female workers, already physically weakened by starvation and emotionally devastated by crushing debt, were repeatedly subjected to horrific sexual abuse and systematic exploitation by the very men who were officially tasked with guarding them. Terrifying threats of further physical violence or the ultimate terror of being permanently locked in the sweltering shipping containers were routinely used to violently coerce these young women into enduring unspeakable acts. Their fragile bodies became yet another tragic commodity to be violently consumed by the deeply corrupt hierarchy of the factory. The traumatized victims of this horrific abuse bore their deep agony in absolute, suffocating silence, paralyzed by overwhelming cultural shame and the terrifying knowledge that there was absolutely no one on the island they could turn to for help. They were trapped in a vast void of justice, completely surrounded by high barbed wire fences and impassable oceans. The calendar turned to November of 1999, bringing with it a suffocating humidity that wrapped around the Dago Apparel compound like a wet, impenetrable blanket. Inside the cavernous manufacturing warehouse, the atmosphere had shifted from a state of chronic misery to an atmosphere thick with an electric, undeniable dread. The ceaseless, deafening roar of the heavy industrial sewing machines continued to vibrate through the concrete floors, but the rhythm was now erratic, fueled by panic rather than routine. Kill Silly, the architect of this monstrous enterprise, had severely miscalculated his production capabilities. He had aggressively overcommitted his enslaved workforce, signing massive, lucrative contracts with prominent mainland United States clothing brands that demanded strict, unyielding delivery schedules. The holiday season was rapidly approaching in the commercial world, and the retail giants required their shipments of garments to stock their pristine department store shelves. The contracts Lee had eagerly signed contained severe financial penalty clauses for any delay. If the massive shipment of clothing was not finalized and loaded onto the cargo ships waiting at the territorial docks by the impending deadline, Daegu Apparel would face catastrophic financial fines that would instantly obliterate his profit margins and potentially bankrupt his entire illicit operation. The immense pressure of the mainland corporate deadlines descended upon the remote island factory, creating a pressure cooker environment where every passing second of lost productivity was viewed as a direct, personal attack on Lee's wealth. The young women, already pushed far beyond the natural limits of human physical and psychological endurance, were now demanded to perform the impossible. The suffocating heat inside the unventilated factory floor escalated as Lee mandated that the machines must not stop under any circumstances. The grueling 14-hour shifts were brutally extended. Sleep was no longer considered a biological necessity, but a punishable offense. The workers, their bodies severely emaciated from months of chronic starvation, their immune systems ravaged, and their minds clouded by perpetual exhaustion, were forced into a state of sheer robotic survival. Their cracked, bleeding fingers moved frantically over the fabric, stitching the vibrant colors of American consumerism while their own vision blurred from extreme malnutrition. The meager rations of boiled cabbage and plain rice were further restricted, weaponized to punish any sector of the factory floor that failed to meet the exponentially increasing hourly production quotas. It was in this environment of absolute, suffocating desperation that the fragile human spirit finally reached its breaking point. The physical reality of their bodies simply refused to comply with the demands of their captors. A quiet, terrifying paralysis began to spread among a specific cohort of the Vietnamese laborers. It was not a calculated, organized rebellion born of political ideology or strategic planning. It was the raw, undeniable collapse of the human anatomy, driven by a primal, overwhelming hunger and a fatigue so deep it ached in their very bones. A group of the women simply stopped working. They slumped over their heavy industrial machines, their hands trembling, tears streaming down their hollow cheeks, and begged in desperate whispers for a momentary reprieve. For a single bowl of edible food, this spontaneous, desperate cessation of labor was perceived by Kil Solee not as a medical emergency, but as an act of profound, unforgivable treason. As the news of the halted production line reached his heavily air-conditioned office, a dark, unrestrained fury completely consumed him, shattering whatever thin veneer of the legitimate businessman he had attempted to maintain. Realizing that threats of financial ruin and future starvation no longer held any power over women who were already starving to death, Lee decided that absolute, unmitigated physical terror was the only remaining instrument of control. He immediately retreated from the warehouse and summoned his inner circle of enforcers, a ruthless syndicate of floor managers and security personnel comprised of both foreign overseers and local guards who had been desensitized to the suffering of the captives. In the hidden shadows of the administrative block, Lee delivered a chilling, definitive directive that would forever mark the history of American Samoa. He stripped away all pretenses of labor management and ordered his men to enforce complete submission through catastrophic violence. He mandated that any worker who displayed defiance, exhaustion, or hesitation was to be beaten without mercy, explicitly assuring his enforcers that he would absorb all responsibility, even if the violence resulted in human fatalities. The sun dipped below the horizon of the South Pacific, plunging the remote island into darkness. But there was no rest within the fortified walls of the Daegu Apparel compound as the enforcers meticulously prepared their instruments of absolute terror. They armed themselves with an assortment of brutal, improvised weapons designed specifically to inflict maximum internal trauma while minimizing the risk of immediate, visible lethal bleeding that might attract unwanted local medical attention. Heavy, solid wooden clubs were gathered, alongside a far more insidious and devastating weapon, thick lengths of industrial polyvinyl chloride pipe. These rigid plastic pipes were deliberately hollowed out and tightly packed with dense, heavy sand, and then sealed at both ends. This sinister modification transformed a common building material into a terrifying bludgeon that possessed the bone-crushing weight of a solid iron bar, capable of delivering agonizing, concussive blows that shattered bones and ruptured internal organs upon impact. The guards, fueled by the explicit permission of their employer and an absolute lack of moral restraint, moved stealthily through the dark, humid courtyard, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel as they approached the fragile wooden doors of the women's dormitories. The atmosphere was terrifyingly silent, heavy with the unspoken anticipation of the impending atrocity. Without any warning, the fragile doors to the living quarters were violently kicked open, shattering the quiet night with a deafening crash. The enforcers surged into the cramped, dimly lit rooms like a pack of rabid predators, instantly plunging the dormitories into a scene of chaotic, unimaginable carnage. The terrified women, rudely awakened from their exhausted slumber, had absolutely no time to comprehend the nightmare unfolding around them, let alone defend themselves against the sudden, overwhelming onslaught. The heavy, sand-filled pipes and thick wooden clubs swung indiscriminately through the suffocating air, finding their marks on fragile shoulders, unprotected ribs, and desperate, raised forearms. The room erupted into a cacophony of bone-chilling shrieks, the dull, sickening thuds of heavy weapons striking human flesh, and the chaotic scrambling of hundreds of women desperately trying to escape the confines of their locked prison. There was absolutely nowhere to run. The women were viciously cornered in the dark, claustrophobic corners of the room, crying out in their native languages, begging for mercy from men who had entirely abandoned their humanity. The guards systematically moved through the huddled masses, delivering punishing blows with absolute, terrifying precision, snapping arms that were raised in desperate attempts to shield faces under the immense weight of the sand-filled plastic pipes. Amidst the swirling chaos, the deafening screams, and the absolute panic of the midnight slaughter, a tragedy of unparalleled horror descended upon a young Vietnamese worker named Quyen. She had been violently pushed against the rough, concrete wall of the dormitory, her small, fragile frame trembling uncontrollably as she desperately tried to shield her head from the relentless rain of blows. In the frantic, bloodthirsty frenzy of the assault, one of the enforcers, his eyes wide with a sadistic, unhinged fury, locked his gaze upon her. He raised a heavy, jagged length of polyvinyl chloride pipe high above his head, but rather than swinging it downward in a blunt arc, he violently thrust the weapon forward like a crude, primitive spear. The sharp, unpolished edge of the heavy plastic pipe struck Quyen with devastating, catastrophic force, tearing through the soft, vulnerable tissue of her face and plunging directly into her eye socket. The sheer brutality of the impact was absolute and entirely irreversible. The agonizing scream that ripped from her throat pierced through the chaotic noise of the room, a sound of such profound, unfathomable agony that it seemed to momentarily freeze the air itself. The crude weapon inflicted massive, immediate biological devastation, causing severe, permanent traumatic trauma to her brain and entirely destroying her eye. She collapsed to the blood-stained concrete floor in a writhing, desperate heap, clutching her ruined face as a heavy pool of dark crimson began to rapidly spread around her trembling body. The horrific, visceral sight of Quyen writhing on the ground finally caused the frenzied momentum of the brutal assault to momentarily falter. The heavy, sand-filled pipes were slowly lowered, and the guards abruptly retreated from the blood-splattered room, leaving behind a scene of utter, devastating devastation. The heavy wooden doors were slammed shut and violently locked from the outside, sealing the battered, traumatized women inside their own private hell. In the terrifying, dark aftermath of the assault, there was absolutely no medical assistance provided to the victims. The physical injuries sustained during the brutal massacre would eventually heal into thick, raised scars, but the deep psychological trauma inflicted upon the women would endure for a lifetime. The Daegu Apparel compound was no longer just a sweatshop. It was a heavily fortified island prison where human life held absolutely no value whatsoever. The long, agonizing night stretched on endlessly as the terrified survivors huddled together in the darkness, mourning the horrific loss of their physical safety and realizing with absolute certainty that their captors were fully prepared to murder them simply to protect corporate profits and Production schedules. The brutal massacre of November 1999 left an indelible stain on the soul of the Daegu apparel compound. In the agonizing weeks that followed the horrific night of violence, the atmosphere within the fortified walls shifted from a state of oppressive exhaustion to a palpable terror. The physical wounds sustained by the terrified women, the shattered bones, the deep lacerations, and the catastrophic injury inflicted upon the eye of the young worker named Kwon were horrifyingly visible, yet it was the profound psychological devastation that truly cemented their captivity. The ruthless enforcers, having demonstrated their absolute willingness to inflict lethal harm without hesitation, now patrolled the sweltering factory floor with an amplified aura of unassailable impunity. The rhythmic thrum of the industrial sewing machines resumed, but the women operating them were no longer merely exhausted laborers, they were entirely broken survivors, forced to relentlessly manufacture garments while existing in a state of perpetual fear. Kil Soo-lee had successfully engineered an environment where death felt like a tangible, looming presence. However, the sheer magnitude of the brutality had inadvertently ignited a fragile spark within the darkest corners of the compound. The women recognized with absolute clarity that their captors possessed no moral boundaries. They understood that if they remained passive, they would eventually perish behind the barbed wire, their bodies discarded and their memories erased. This profound realization fostered a quiet, deeply clandestine movement among the most resilient of the captives. They began to take unimaginable risks, whispering terrified messages through the chain-link fences during the darkest hours of the night, desperately attempting to establish a fragile line of communication with members of the local Samoan religious organizations who occasionally passed near the perimeter. These initial, trembling efforts were incredibly dangerous, fraught with the constant risk of lethal retaliation, but they represented the very first cracks in the impenetrable fortress. The ultimate turning point, the singular action that would eventually dismantle the criminal empire of Kil Soo-lee, did not originate from a complex tactical operation. It was born from a moment of sheer human desperation and extraordinary courage. Amidst the relentless heat and the constant surveillance, one of the severely emaciated workers recognized a fleeting, desperately brief window of opportunity. A heavy cargo truck, loaded with the garments the women had bled to produce, was preparing to exit the fortified gates of the Tufuna compound to transport the goods to the docks. The massive iron gates were momentarily wide open, and the guards were briefly distracted by the logistical process of inspecting the loaded vehicle. With trembling hands and a heart pounding a frantic rhythm, the worker frantically searched for any implement to convey her desperate plea. On a tiny, crumpled scrap of discarded paper, she managed to scrawl a deeply urgent message consisting of just a few jagged letters. She wrote the universal plea for salvation, SOS, followed immediately by the desperate command, Help US. As the heavy diesel engine roared to life and the massive vehicle began its slow departure toward the open gates, she made a split-second decision. Risking immediate execution if caught, she lunged toward the passing vehicle. With a desperate flick of her wrist, she tossed the tiny scrap of paper straight through a narrow gap in the partially open window of the truck's cab. The small piece of paper tumbled through the humid air, carrying the heavy weight of hundreds of lives, and vanished from her sight. The agonizing hours that followed were filled with a terrifying uncertainty. She had absolutely no way of knowing if the driver had noticed the missive, if the note had simply blown away into the foliage, or if it would be discovered by someone sympathetic to the factory management. It was a monumental leap of faith into an absolute void. Miraculously, the fragile piece of paper did not simply disappear into the dense air of the South Pacific. By a profound twist of fate, the desperate message eventually found its way into the hands of individuals entirely outside the corrupt sphere of Kil Soo-lee's influence. The chilling simplicity of the message, combined with the growing whispers circulating within the local religious communities regarding the highly secretive factory, finally triggered an undeniable alarm. The concerning information was swiftly and urgently relayed beyond the isolated shores of American Samoa, ascending the complex ladder of federal authority until it reached the highest echelons of the United States Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. The initial reaction among federal prosecutors and seasoned investigators was one of profound disbelief. The very concept that a massive slave camp, holding hundreds of captive foreign nationals, was actively operating with complete impunity on officially recognized United States territory was entirely inconceivable. It directly contradicted the fundamental principles of the American legal system. However, as the frantic reports from the remote island territory were meticulously analyzed and corroborated, the devastating reality of the situation became undeniably clear. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, an agency accustomed to dismantling complex organized crime syndicates and tracking domestic terrorists, was immediately mobilized to address an unprecedented human rights catastrophe. Recognizing the extreme danger posed to the hundreds of desperate captives held behind the barbed wire, the Department of Justice mandated that a massive, highly coordinated federal operation must be executed with absolute precision and devastating speed. The logistical challenges facing the Federal Bureau of Investigation were monumental. American Samoa was incredibly remote, situated thousands of miles away from the vast resources and immediate tactical support available on the mainland. Furthermore, the authorities understood that Kill Suli was a deeply cunning and entirely ruthless adversary. If he received even the slightest warning that federal agents were aggressively circling his operation, he possessed the complete capacity and the undeniable willingness to systematically destroy crucial evidence, forcibly relocate the highly vulnerable captives, or orchestrate an absolute massacre to completely silence the witnesses. Therefore, the preliminary stages of the federal investigation were conducted under a shroud of absolute, impenetrable secrecy. Specialized teams of highly trained federal agents quietly descended upon the remote island, blending entirely into the dense background. They meticulously gathered critical intelligence, covertly monitoring the heavily fortified perimeter of the Daegu Apparel compound, thoroughly analyzing the complex logistical movements of the cargo trucks, and desperately attempting to establish the precise number of human lives trapped inside the terrifying facility. The seasoned investigators systematically built an airtight operational plan, preparing to execute a sudden, overwhelming tactical strike designed to immediately neutralize the heavily armed security forces, instantly secure the sprawling industrial perimeter, and safely extract the traumatized victims before Kill Suli could even begin to react. The immense tension mounted heavily as the specialized federal strike teams finalized their meticulous preparations, standing incredibly ready to forcefully breach the iron gates of a modern-day concentration camp operating silently under the vibrant tropical sun. When the meticulously planned federal operation finally commenced, the sheer speed and absolute force of this sudden tactical strike completely shattered the terrifying reality of the Daegu Apparel compound. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, coordinating seamlessly with specialized law enforcement tactical units, descended violently upon the Tafuna industrial facility with an overwhelming show of absolute federal authority. The heavy, rusted iron gates that had effectively sealed the terrified women inside their personal hell for agonizing months were forcefully breached. Swarms of highly trained, heavily armed federal agents poured into the dusty courtyard, loudly shouting clear commands that echoed sharply against the cold concrete walls of the sweatshop. The ruthless enforcers and the corrupt local guards, who had previously operated with absolute impunity, were instantly paralyzed by the sudden magnitude of the federal raid. Within mere terrifying minutes, the individuals who had brutally beaten, violently starved, and psychologically tortured the desperate workers were forcefully subdued, their hands securely restrained behind their backs as the reality of federal prosecution finally descended upon them. The deeply oppressive, highly organized system of brutal captivity that Kill Suli had so carefully constructed was violently and completely dismantled in a single, perfectly executed tactical maneuver. As the factory was rapidly secured, the agents cautiously pushed deep into the suffocating residential dormitories and heavily fortified production floors. The scene that awaited the highly experienced investigators completely shook them to their very core. The veteran agents, individuals who had personally witnessed the darkest depths of criminal depravity throughout their careers, were profoundly moved by the sheer magnitude of the human suffering hidden within the compound. Hundreds of deeply traumatized, severely emaciated women cautiously emerged from the dark shadows, their hollow eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and incredibly fragile disbelief. They were dressed in dirty, ragged uniforms, their fragile bodies bearing the horrific scars of severe physical abuse, chronic malnutrition, and absolute exhaustion. The deeply emotional realization that the heavily armed individuals surging into the dark compound were not arriving to inflict further punishment, but were actually there to finally deliver absolute salvation, slowly washed over the desperate captives. Emergency medical personnel rapidly flooded into the highly secured zone, urgently establishing comprehensive triage centers to immediately treat the severe physical injuries, the rampant infections, and the absolute starvation that had deeply ravaged the workforce. The terrified women, many of whom had completely lost all hope of ever seeing the outside world again, were gently and safely escorted out from behind the sharp coils of barbed wire. For the very first time in agonizing months, they were finally able to breathe the humid air as entirely free individuals, forever leaving the absolute nightmare of the Daegu apparel factory far behind them as they were safely transported to secured locations to begin their long journey toward healing and justice. The dismantling of the Daegu apparel compound by federal agents was merely the conclusion of the physical nightmare, but it marked the absolute beginning of a monumental legal battle that would test the very limits of the United States justice system. Following the overwhelming, sudden federal raid on the Tafuna industrial facility, Kil-Soo-Lee was immediately taken into federal custody, his sprawling empire of human exploitation collapsing around him in a matter of minutes. However, the Department of Justice recognized an immediate and profound procedural vulnerability in the impending prosecution, trying a man of Lee's immense financial resources and deeply entrenched political connections within the relatively small and isolated judicial ecosystem of American Samoa presented an entirely unacceptable risk. Throughout his horrific, unchecked tenure on the island territory, Lee had systematically cultivated a sprawling, highly corrupt network of bribery and illicit local influence, effectively ensuring that territorial authorities remained entirely blind to the catastrophic human rights violations occurring just beyond the barbed wire of his garment factory. To guarantee a completely fair, impartial, and entirely incorruptible legal process, federal prosecutors made the highly strategic and largely unprecedented decision to completely remove the trial from the territory where the crimes were committed. Kil-Soo-Lee was heavily shackled, placed under maximum security protocols, and securely transported across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, forcibly relocated to the absolute jurisdiction of the United States District Court located in Honolulu, Hawaii. This crucial change of venue successfully stripped the criminal mastermind of his local protections, placing him entirely at the mercy of federal statutes designed precisely to prosecute the most egregious forms of organized human exploitation. The intricate process of constructing the comprehensive legal case against Kil-Soo-Lee and his syndicate of brutal enforcers was a logistical undertaking of truly staggering proportions. The federal prosecutors and seasoned investigators were not simply dealing with a localized, standard criminal offense. They were attempting to fully dissect a massive, highly sophisticated international human trafficking network that spanned multiple continents and exploited the most vulnerable populations. The initial evidentiary phase required the meticulous cataloging of thousands upon thousands of pages of deeply incriminating documents seized directly from the administrative offices of the Daegu Apparel facility. Dedicated forensic accountants spent agonizing, continuous months tracing the complex, highly illicit financial networks, conclusively and mathematically proving that the promised lucrative American wages were virtually never paid to the laborers, while the exorbitant recruitment debts remained aggressively and violently enforced. Beyond the extensive paper trail, the physical evidence of the daily atrocities was chillingly abundant and impossible to refute. Law enforcement officials formally cataloged and entered into evidence the heavy, blood-stained wooden clubs and the terrifyingly modified, sand-filled polyvinyl chloride pipes that had been routinely utilized by the guards to violently shatter bones and enforce absolute compliance upon the starving workforce. However, The most vital and infinitely most complex component of the sprawling investigation was securing the formal, legally binding testimonies of the survivors. Over 200 deeply traumatized, physically broken women had to be carefully interviewed by specialized federal agents utilizing highly trained, culturally sensitive translators. This process was incredibly delicate, requiring the investigators to gently guide the fragile survivors through the agonizing process of recalling their darkest, most terrifying memories, transforming their raw, unspeakable trauma into formal affidavits that could withstand the aggressive scrutiny of a federal courtroom defense. The culmination of this exhaustive, multi-year federal investigation finally materialized in the year 2005 as the high-stakes criminal trial officially commenced within the solemn, highly sterile walls of the federal courthouse in Honolulu. The atmosphere inside the courtroom on the opening day was thick with a palpable, deeply profound gravity. Kilsili, a man who had previously operated as an untouchable, authoritarian dictator within his heavily fortified island compound, now sat silently at the defense table, his demeanor reflecting a chilling, unyielding arrogance. Despite facing the overwhelming, combined legal weight of the United States federal government, he maintained an entirely defiant posture, completely devoid of any visible remorse or basic human empathy. He was formally indicted on a staggering 14 separate, highly severe federal charges. The prosecution painstakingly detailed a horrifying litany of calculated crimes, systematically charging the businessman with widespread human trafficking, the brutal enforcement of involuntary servitude, elaborate international extortion schemes, systemic physical abuse, extensive conspiracy to actively deprive human beings of their fundamental civil rights, and the extensive bribery of local governmental officials to actively conceal the sprawling operation from mainland oversight. The federal prosecutors systematically laid out their opening arguments, painting a devastating, meticulously detailed portrait of a modern-day slave plantation operating completely unabated on officially recognized American soil. A scenario that fundamentally violated the absolute core principles of human liberty and constitutional protection. The high-priced defense attorneys aggressively attempted to obfuscate the horrific reality of the situation, launching a deeply cynical, highly orchestrated legal strategy designed entirely to minimize the catastrophic suffering of the victims. They attempted to portray the horrific events not as a highly coordinated, intentional campaign of modern slavery, but rather as an unfortunate, localized labor dispute that had simply spiraled out of control due to the unauthorized actions of rogue, lower-level management personnel. They continuously attempted to distance Kilsili from the visceral violence of the factory floor, arguing vehemently that the severe physical punishments and the systematic starvation protocols were implemented without his direct, explicit authorization or personal knowledge. To utterly demolish this fabricated, insulting narrative, the federal prosecutors unleashed an overwhelming, undeniable avalanche of irrefutable physical and forensic evidence. They projected massive, horrifying photographs onto the courtroom walls, visually documenting the towering barbed wire fences, the suffocating, unventilated metal shipping containers utilized for solitary confinement and thermal torture, and the squalid, incredibly overcrowded living conditions that had ravaged the captive workforce. Medical experts took the stand, delivering clinical, deeply disturbing analyses of the profound physical devastation inflicted upon the young women. They detailed the severe, chronic malnutrition that had caused organs to fail, the rampant, untreated infectious diseases that spread through the dormitories, and the deeply permanent, crippling orthopedic injuries sustained from the relentless beatings. The sterile, highly specific medical terminology echoed chillingly through the silent courtroom, providing undeniable, scientific validation of the absolute torture that had transpired over those agonizing months. Yet, the most profound, emotionally shattering moments of the entire legal proceeding occurred when the survivors themselves were finally called to the witness stand. The sheer, unfathomable courage required for these young women, individuals who had been systematically stripped of their humanity and violently conditioned to fear their powerful captors, to sit in an open courtroom and directly confront the very architect of their profound suffering was absolutely monumental Through dedicated translators, their voices, often trembling with deep, unresolved trauma but radiating an undeniable internal strength, echoed powerfully through the vast judicial chamber. They recounted the deceptive, highly intoxicating promises of the American dream that had initially lured them away from their desperate, impoverished families. They meticulously detailed the terrifying moment their passports were confiscated upon arrival, the agonizing, endless months of extreme starvation, and the suffocating, inescapable dread that permeated every single second of their captivity in the tropical heat. The entire courtroom was brought to an absolute standstill as the harrowing narrative of the November massacre was slowly and painfully recounted for the official public record. The federal jury listened in horrified, absolute silence as the brutal, unprovoked midnight assault was described in vivid, agonizing detail, culminating in the tragic, catastrophic blinding of the young worker named Quyen. The raw, completely unfiltered emotion pouring directly from the witness stand completely dismantled the cynical, highly calculated defense strategy, permanently replacing the abstract, theoretical legal arguments with the devastating, undeniable reality of immense human suffering and survival. The overwhelming mountain of irrefutable physical evidence, seamlessly combined with the deeply powerful, highly harrowing testimonies of the resilient survivors, left absolutely no room for any reasonable legal doubt. The federal jury deliberately evaluated the monumental case, carefully weighing the horrific realities that had been meticulously exposed during the intense, deeply draining proceedings. When the members of the jury finally returned to the solemn courtroom, their decision was absolute, unanimous, and entirely uncompromising. The foreman stood and delivered the sweeping verdict, formally declaring Kilsili completely guilty on all 14 federal charges brought against him by the Department of Justice. The profound silence of the courtroom was momentarily shattered by a collective exhalation of breath, a profound, deeply emotional acknowledgement that a monumental measure of justice had finally been achieved for the voiceless victims. The sentencing phase that immediately followed the conviction was explicitly designed to ensure that the architect of this catastrophic human suffering would never again possess the capability or the freedom to exploit another vulnerable human being. The presiding federal judge, delivering a deeply stern and entirely unyielding rebuke of the unprecedented, calculated cruelty exhibited throughout the entire manufacturing operation, sentenced Kilsili to an incredibly severe term of 40 continuous years in federal prison, effectively ensuring that the convicted trafficker would spend the vast remainder of his natural life securely locked behind the impenetrable, concrete walls of a maximum security penitentiary. In addition to the massive custodial sentence, the federal court also actively sought to address the profound financial devastation that had been systematically and ruthlessly inflicted upon the victims and their desperate families back in their remote home countries. The judge issued a sweeping, legally binding mandate, officially ordering the convicted mastermind to pay a staggering $1.8 million in direct financial restitution to the hundreds of survivors. While the court fully acknowledged the deeply frustrating reality that Kilsili had likely utilized highly sophisticated, illicit offshore methods to completely hide or rapidly dissipate the vast majority of his ill-gotten wealth prior to his arrest, the monumental restitution order stood as a deeply vital, highly symbolic declaration of the monumental financial theft that had been perpetrated against the vulnerable laborers. Furthermore, the sweeping arm of federal justice did not stop at the very top of the brutal hierarchy. The ruthless floor managers, the deeply corrupt local enforcers, and the highly sadistic guards who had actively wielded the sand-filled pipes and mercilessly carried out the terrifying orders of their employer were also systematically prosecuted for their direct, undeniable roles in the massive criminal conspiracy. They were individually tried, convicted, and appropriately sentenced to highly significant terms in federal custody, receiving strict prison sentences ranging from 4 to 10 continuous years. This secondary wave of prosecutions effectively and permanently dismantled the entire brutal command structure that had so efficiently transformed a remote island factory into a modern-day concentration camp. The absolute finality of these sweeping federal judgments marked the definitive, legally binding conclusion to one of the darkest, most profoundly disturbing chapters in the entire history of American labor, permanently sealing the horrific fate of the deeply corrupt individuals who had so callously monetized the absolute suffering of innocent human beings. The echoing finality of the judge's gavel inside the Honolulu courtroom did not merely mark the conclusion of a highly publicized federal trial, it initiated a profound, deafening silence that settled over the intricate, devastating saga of Daegu apparel. For Kilsali, that resounding strike signified the absolute end of his tyrannical empire and the beginning of a bleak, heavily regimented existence within the unforgiving concrete walls of a maximum security federal penitentiary. However, for the hundreds of young women who had endured the unimaginable horrors of his island compound, the verdict represented a vastly different, infinitely more complex threshold. They had secured a monumental legal victory, yet they were left standing in the chaotic, uncertain aftermath of their own survival. The heavy iron chains of their physical captivity had been decisively severed by federal intervention, but the deeply entrenched, invisible psychological shackles forged through months of systematic starvation, relentless physical brutality, and absolute emotional terror remained fiercely intertwined with their daily existence. The physical injuries they had sustained, the violently shattered bones, the deep lacerations, and the catastrophic, irreversible blinding of the young worker during the horrific November massacre would eventually stabilize into permanent physical scars. These visible marks served as a constant, somber testament to the terrifying reality of their ordeal, a map of survival etched directly onto their fragile bodies. Yet, it was the profound, unseen devastation of their mental landscapes that required the most grueling and arduous journey toward healing. They had been violently stripped of their fundamental human dignity, aggressively conditioned to expect betrayal and pain. And they now faced the monumental task of completely rebuilding their shattered trust in humanity and entirely reconstructing their own internal sense of self-worth from the absolute ground up. The justice delivered in the courtroom was absolute and necessary, but it could not magically erase the agonizing nights spent suffocating in the dark isolation boxes or the pervasive, chilling fear that had permeated every waking moment behind the barbed wire fences of the Tufune industrial complex. The United States government, profoundly confronted by the staggering magnitude of the human rights catastrophe that had been allowed to operate completely unchecked on its own territorial soil, recognized an absolute moral imperative to provide a tangible pathway toward restoration for the survivors. In a deeply significant and historically unprecedented administrative maneuver, the federal authorities acknowledged that simply deporting these deeply traumatized women back to the crushing poverty and the aggressive loan sharks in their rural home countries would constitute a secondary, equally devastating human rights violation. To prevent this catastrophic outcome, the government granted the survivors a highly specialized immigration status, issuing them customized visas specifically designed for the victims of severe human trafficking. This crucial legal designation provided the women with the absolute right to legally remain within the borders of the United States, offering them a highly protected, secure foundation upon which they could attempt to rebuild their completely shattered lives. The deep irony of this development was absolutely inescapable and profoundly bitter. These young women had originally sacrificed everything, plunging their families into catastrophic debt and enduring unimaginable suffering, all for the singular, desperate hope of accessing the fabled promise of American prosperity. They had ultimately achieved that initial geographical goal, but the devastating price they were violently forced to pay for their legal residency was exacted in blood, absolute terror, and the permanent loss of their youthful innocence. The dream they had chased across the vast Pacific Ocean had materialized only after they had survived a literal, waking nightmare engineered by a ruthless predator. Armed with their new legal status, the survivors embarked on a daunting, deeply emotional migration away from the isolated shores of the South Pacific and toward the sprawling, unfamiliar expanse of the mainland United States. The transition was incredibly jarring. They were suddenly thrust into bustling, highly complex urban environments that bore absolutely no resemblance to the quiet, agrarian villages of their youth or the suffocating, heavily fortified confines of the island sweatshop. They faced the immediate, overwhelming challenges of navigating a completely foreign culture, learning a new, highly complex language, and attempting to secure safe, ethical employment in a society that was entirely alien to them. Yet, despite the deeply overwhelming obstacles and the heavy, lingering weight of their profound trauma, these women demonstrated an astonishing, virtually incomprehensible reservoir of internal resilience. They slowly, painstakingly began the arduous process of weaving themselves into the complex fabric of their new communities. They found honest work in various manufacturing sectors, local culinary establishments, and community service organizations. This time protected by the rigid enforcement of ethical labor laws and guaranteed fair compensation for their hard work. With their fiercely earned wages, they immediately resumed the very mission that had initially driven them into the dangerous arms of the international labor brokers. They steadily, diligently funneled their financial earnings back across the ocean, slowly dismantling the astronomical debts that had threatened to entirely consume their families and ultimately securing the long-term financial stability they had always desperately envisioned. Their survival was no longer simply a matter of enduring physical torture. It had miraculously transformed into a quiet, deeply profound triumph of the human spirit over absolute, calculated malice. The sheer, undeniable horror of the Daegu apparel case sent massive, irreversible shockwaves through the highest echelons of the United States legislative system. Prior to the explosive revelation of the Tafuna slave camp, the federal statutes regarding human trafficking and forced labor were shockingly antiquated, fragmented, and severely ill-equipped to handle the highly sophisticated, highly mobile nature of modern international exploitation networks. The deeply disturbing reality that a massive, highly organized criminal syndicate could efficiently import hundreds of foreign nationals and operate a brutal concentration camp disguised as a legitimate garment factory on American territory forced a profound, immediate reckoning within the halls of Congress. The agonizing testimonies of the survivors and the absolute depravity of kill solely served as the undeniable catalyst for a monumental legislative overhaul. In the year 2000, directly propelled by the outrage generated by this specific case, the United States Congress overwhelmingly passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This landmark, entirely comprehensive legislation fundamentally redefined the federal approach to human exploitation. It drastically elevated the legal severity of trafficking offenses, establishing incredibly harsh, mandatory federal sentences for anyone convicted of orchestrating involuntary servitude or forced labor. Crucially, the legislation completely eradicated the jurisdictional loopholes that had previously allowed isolated territories like American Samoa to operate with minimal federal oversight, demanding absolute, uncompromising accountability across all sovereign American lands. Furthermore, the act formally institutionalized the very visa protections that had been granted to the Daegu survivors, mandating that the victims of these horrific crimes must be treated not as undocumented criminals subject to immediate deportation, but as deeply vulnerable individuals deserving of immediate protection, comprehensive social services, and a secure pathway to permanent legal residency. The agonizing suffering endured within the walls of the island compound had directly resulted in a permanent, fiercely protective legal shield for countless future generations. As we look back upon the chilling legacy of this case, we are forced to engage in a deeply uncomfortable, highly necessary reflection regarding the complex, often hidden mechanisms of our modern global economy. The garments that were violently stitched together by starving, terrified women under the oppressive heat of the tropical sun were not destined for obscure, unregulated markets. They were systematically packaged, loaded onto massive cargo vessels, and shipped directly to the pristine, brightly lit shelves of major, highly respected retail establishments across the mainland United States. Consumers unknowingly purchased these items, completely oblivious to the unimaginable human agony that was seamlessly woven into every single seam. The horrifying reality of Daegu apparel entirely strips away the comforting, carefully constructed illusions of ethical consumerism, violently exposing the dark, extremely profitable underbelly of an industry driven entirely by the relentless demand for cheap, rapid production. It stands as a dark, permanent monument to the terrifying ease with which the legitimate pursuit of corporate profit can seamlessly degenerate into the absolute commodification of human life when oversight fails and greed is allowed to operate completely unchecked in the dark corners of the world. Yet, amidst the profound darkness of the systemic exploitation and the severe, calculated brutality, the story of these incredible women ultimately endures as a profound, brilliant testament to the absolute unbreakability of the human spirit. They were systematically targeted precisely because they were perceived as entirely vulnerable, completely disposable, and fundamentally voiceless. Kill Sully meticulously calculated that their deep poverty and their profound isolation would render them incapable of mounting any significant resistance against his terrifying, heavily armed regime. He was catastrophically wrong. Through their quiet, desperate acts of absolute defiance, through a single, terrifyingly brave plea for salvation tossed into the humid wind, and through their incredible, unwavering courage to stand before a federal court and speak the absolute truth, they completely dismantled an international criminal empire. They entirely transformed their profound, unspeakable victimization into an undeniable catalyst for sweeping, historical change. The heavy, rusted gates of the Tafuna compound have long since been permanently sealed, and the oppressive, deafening roar of the heavy industrial sewing machines has finally been completely silenced. But the incredibly powerful, deeply resonant legacy of the survivors continues to echo loudly through the strict, protective mandates of federal law and through the deeply quiet, fiercely determined dignity of the entirely new lives they forged from the ashes of their absolute worst nightmare. Their deeply profound journey forces us to continuously confront the darkest, most terrifying realities of human cruelty, while simultaneously demanding that we bear absolute witness to the extraordinary, undeniable power of human survival. The aftermath of the Daegu Apparel trial was not merely a conclusion to a singular criminal case, it served as a permanent, haunting mirror for American society to confront the uncomfortable intersection of global consumerism and the brutal exploitation of the vulnerable. While the legislative machinery of the United States had been effectively upgraded through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and the immediate physical threat posed by Kill Sully had been permanently neutralized within the confines of a maximum security prison, the broader, more insidious structures that had allowed such an operation to thrive remained deeply embedded within the global supply chain. For the survivors, the post-trial era was characterized by an ongoing, quiet struggle to reconcile their past identity as captive laborers with their new existence as autonomous residents in a foreign land. They did not simply disappear into the vastness of the American population. They became a living, breathing testament to the profound resilience of those who have stared directly into the abyss of absolute evil and refused to be consumed by it. Their journey highlights the critical necessity of constant vigilance, demonstrating that the protection of fundamental human rights cannot be left to the passive inertia of governmental bureaucracy, but must be actively defended by those who possess the moral clarity to recognize when the pursuit of profit has entirely eclipsed the value of human life. The story of Daegu Apparel serves as an eternal, sobering reminder that the darkest corners of the world are often not located in the most remote, unreachable regions of the globe, but can exist in plain sight, camouflaged by the respectable trappings of international business and the apathy of a marketplace that prioritizes convenience above all else. The psychological landscape of the survivors in the years following the federal verdict underwent a complex, often nonlinear transformation. Many of these women, once liberated from the physical confines of the Tafuna compound, found that the true battle for their freedom had only just begun. The trauma of their enslavement, characterized by the systematic denial of their agency, the constant threat of lethal violence, and the crushing weight of their family's financial survival, had deeply altered their nervous systems. For a significant portion of the survivors, the sound of a heavy door slamming shut or the sight of an aggressive authority figure could trigger intense, debilitating flashbacks that momentarily transported them back to the sweltering, dark dormitories of the compound. They lived in a state of profound, hypervigilant consciousness, a defense mechanism that had been essential for survival behind the barbed wire but which proved incredibly obstructive in the context of a peaceful, civilian life. However, they were not left to navigate this deep, internal wreckage entirely in isolation. The survivors formed deep, unshakable bonds of solidarity, a community forged in the fires of their shared trauma. This network of mutual support proved to be their most effective sanctuary. They gathered in quiet, private spaces, sometimes thousands of miles away from the tropical heat of the island, to share their experiences in a way that no psychologist or legal advocate could ever fully facilitate. In these spaces, they were not victims or witnesses in a federal case. They were survivors who had collectively orchestrated the dismantling of an empire of evil. This transition from passive object of exploitation to active agent of their own recovery represents the most profound victory of their entire ordeal. As time marched forward, the legacy of their experience began to permeate the public consciousness, albeit in ways that were often misunderstood or dangerously simplified. The mainstream narrative often focused exclusively on the sensational details of the physical abuse or the dramatic, cinematic nature of the FBI raid, effectively reducing the multifaceted lives of these women to the singular, tragic experience of their enslavement. To counter this, many of the survivors took the courageous, deeply individual step of reclaiming their own narratives. They understood that the true power of their story lay not in the graphic nature of their suffering, but in the enduring strength of their humanity. Some chose to engage with advocacy groups dedicated to eradicating human trafficking, lending their voices to the global conversation about the necessity of supply chain transparency and corporate accountability. Others chose to pursue the private, quiet milestones of a life once deemed impossible, graduating from educational programs, building their own small, independent businesses, and raising their children in an environment where they were protected by the very laws they had been instrumental in forcing into existence. Every single life event, no matter how small, became a form of subtle, ongoing defiance against the man who had attempted to erase their individual identities. They had been treated as interchangeable, disposable components of a factory machine, and yet, through their sustained, deliberate reclamation of their own lives, they proved that their agency was entirely indestructible. Their existence became a daily, lived refutation of the ideology of exploitation that Kill Sutley had so ruthlessly championed. The impact of the Daegu apparel case on the evolution of corporate responsibility within the garment industry cannot be overstated. For decades, major international clothing brands had maintained a highly effective, strategically constructed wall of ignorance regarding the specific conditions under which their products were manufactured. By outsourcing their production to complex webs of third-party contractors, these corporations successfully bypassed direct oversight, effectively insulating themselves from the legal and moral consequences of the conditions on the factory floor. The Daegu apparel disaster, however, violently breached this wall. It forced a moment of intense, global scrutiny upon the industry, exposing the devastating reality that the Made in USA label was not necessarily a guarantee of ethical labor standards, but potentially a badge of profound, hidden human misery. In the immediate aftermath of the federal investigation, there was a brief, intense period of public outrage and legislative posturing. Major retailers scrambled to implement internal auditing systems, promising a new era of transparency and strict adherence to human rights standards. While these efforts were often criticized as being largely performative and insufficient to fundamentally alter the exploitative structure of global manufacturing, they nonetheless established a new, public baseline for corporate accountability. The Daegu case became the standard example used by labor activists, human rights organizations, and international watchdogs to argue that companies must be held legally responsible for the labor practices occurring within their entire, multi-layered supply chain. The survivors were not merely passive casualties of this process. They were the primary, undeniable evidence that made the status quo entirely indefensible. The cultural memory of the Pacific island where the tragedy occurred also underwent a significant, often painful metamorphosis. For the local community of American Samoa, the legacy of the Daegu apparel case was fraught with deep, lingering complexities. There was a profound, deeply felt sense of communal shame that such an atrocity had occurred within their boundaries, an event that directly challenged the deeply held traditional values of the island's culture, which emphasize family, community, and the sanctity of human connection. The association of their home with the horrific branding of a slave camp was an agonizing, lasting stigma that many residents felt compelled to confront and ultimately overcome. In the years following the trial, the island began to place a much stronger, more proactive emphasis on the strict monitoring of foreign investment and the rigorous enforcement of labor and safety regulations. There was an increased awareness of the vulnerabilities inherent in their unique, semi-autonomous status, and a collective determination to ensure that never again would their home be weaponized to exploit the desperate and the vulnerable. The physical site of the factory, once a scene of unimaginable darkness, was reclaimed by the island, scrubbed clean of its violent history, and repurposed to serve the needs of the local community, effectively erasing the physical remnants of the factory's past to allow for a future defined by local integrity rather than imported exploitation. Reflecting upon the entirety of this 7-part journey into the heart of one of the most significant human rights cases in American legal history, one is left with an overwhelming sense of the fragile, precarious nature of human dignity. The story of Daegu Apparel is, at its core, a story about the absolute necessity of recognizing the humanity of the other. Kilsuli succeeded in his monstrous ambition for as long as he did precisely because the global system was designed to dehumanize the laborers. They were reduced to numbers, production quotas, and disposable variables in a financial equation. The federal intervention, the courageous testimonies of the survivors, and the subsequent legislative reform were all centered on a single, powerful act of recognition, the public acknowledgement that these women were not disposable commodities, but individuals possessing the same fundamental rights and the same inherent dignity as any other human being. This fundamental, radical recognition remains the most powerful tool available for combating the scourge of modern human trafficking. It is a recognition that must be persistently applied to every level of our global economic structure, from the boardrooms of massive international corporations to the local, overlooked corners of our own communities. The legacy of the survivors is not a finished chapter. It is a continuously evolving, highly active force that challenges us to look beyond the surface of our consumer habits and confront the human realities hidden behind the labels of our daily lives. Ultimately, the survivors of Daegu Apparel are not just the heroes of a true crime narrative. They are the architects of a safer, more transparent global future. Their bravery in the face of absolute despair and their subsequent success in building meaningful, independent lives stand as a profound, eternal inspiration for the ongoing global struggle against modern slavery. They have permanently altered the legal landscape, influenced the ethics of international trade, and provided a resonant, undeniable voice for those who still find themselves trapped in the shadows of exploitation. Their story teaches us that even when the machinery of power seems insurmountable and the darkness of exploitation appears entirely absolute, the resilience of the human heart possesses the potential to shatter the strongest locks and illuminate the most hidden atrocities. The sacrifice they were forced to make was monumental, a price no human being should ever have to pay, but the impact of their survival continues to ripple across the world, creating a permanent, vigilant barrier against the return of the horrors they were instrumental in exposing. As the years continue to pass and the details of the trial recede into the depths of historical archives, the vital, resonant truth remains. The fight for human rights is a constant, unrelenting process that depends entirely upon our collective capacity to see, to listen, and to demand that justice is never silenced by the siren call of profit. Their journey is a testament to the fact that while the human capacity for cruelty is deep, the human capacity for resilience, truth, and ultimate justice is, in the final analysis, infinitely greater. The final echoes of the Daegu Apparel saga serve as a profound testament to the necessity of systemic introspection, a reminder that the eradication of human trafficking is not a destination achieved through a single judicial victory, but a continuous, unwavering commitment to human dignity that must be upheld in every sector of our globalized society. As the years have transitioned into decades, the narrative of this tragedy has evolved from a gripping chronicle of crime and punishment into a foundational case study for human rights advocacy, legal reform, and the ethics of international labor. The transformation is deeply significant, for it shifts the focus from the grotesque details of the abuse to the structural failures that permitted such conditions to exist in the first place. The story of those 200 women who braved the hell of the Tufuna compound is now inextricably woven into the fabric of the modern anti-trafficking movement, serving as a beacon of truth that pierces through the sanitized marketing of global trade. It is a story that demands we acknowledge our own complicity as consumers, forcing us to recognize that the low cost of our clothing is often subsidized by the stolen lives of individuals who share our inherent right to freedom but are denied its reality by systems of unchecked power and systemic indifference. The survivors, in their quiet persistence and their ongoing journey toward total restoration, have become the most powerful witnesses to the efficacy of the law when it is finally forcefully directed toward the protection of the powerless. Their lives are no longer defined by the trauma they endured at the hands of Kil Suli, but by the agency they demonstrated in securing their own futures and the future protection of those who might have otherwise fallen into this same darkness. The evolution of the United States legal framework following the Daegu investigation has proven to be a vital instrument in the ongoing struggle against modern slavery. Yet it also highlights the persistent, formidable challenges that remain in a world that is increasingly interconnected and difficult to regulate. While the Trafficking Victims Protection Act provided the necessary legal teeth to prosecute human traffickers with unprecedented severity, the shadowy networks that facilitate this exploitation are constantly evolving, becoming more clandestine, more technologically sophisticated, and more effective at exploiting the gaps between differing international jurisdictions. The Daegu apparel case was a critical awakening, a violent ripping away of the veil that had shielded the industry from the consequences of its own negligence. However, the vigilance required to maintain this awareness is immense. It requires a sustained, grassroots demand for transparency that persists long after the headlines have faded and the initial shock of a major expose has dissipated. The survivors' success in navigating their new lives in the United States, while a monumental personal achievement, also underscores the immense resource requirements necessary to provide effective, long-term support for victims of such extreme exploitation. True justice, as demonstrated by their experience, must go beyond the delivery of a guilty verdict and the imposition of a prison sentence. It must include the provision of the psychological, social, and economic resources necessary to truly mend a shattered existence and reintegrate an individual into a society that had previously failed to protect them. In the broader context of human history, the Daegu apparel tragedy will likely be remembered as a pivotal moment, a fracture in the long, often ignored narrative of labor exploitation in the Pacific. It challenged the prevailing assumptions about the nature of sovereignty and federal responsibility in outlying territories, effectively mandating that the protection of human rights cannot be diluted by geographical distance or territorial status. The moral weight of the survivors' courage has fundamentally altered the discourse surrounding the ethics of garment manufacturing, compelling major global brands to acknowledge that their responsibility for the treatment of their workers begins at the very first stage of production, regardless of how many layers of subcontractors may stand between the corporate office and the factory floor. This shift in discourse is not merely academic. It is a pragmatic, survival-oriented imperative for millions of workers worldwide who continue to labor in conditions that mirror, to varying degrees, the horrors once found in the Tufuna facility. The Daegu case provides the conceptual framework, the legal precedent, and the profound, undeniable moral authority to challenge these conditions wherever they arise, reinforcing the reality that every individual, regardless of their nationality or legal status, is entitled to work in an environment free from violence, coercion, and the systematic denial of their most basic human needs. The women who walked out of those gates in Tufuna have ensured that their suffering would not be in vain and their enduring impact serves as a permanent, vigilant barrier against the return of such unchecked, predatory practices. As we continue to navigate the complexities of a globalized economy that often prioritizes rapid profit over the inherent value of human life, the memory of those days in 1999 serves as a grounding force, a reminder of what is at stake when we lose our collective commitment to fundamental human rights. The story of the survivors is not just a dark chapter from the past. It is a living, breathing guide for how to confront and dismantle the systems that seek to profit from the exploitation of the marginalized. Their journey from the depth of utter darkness to the light of their current lives is a profound, indelible triumph of human agency, proving that even when the machinery of oppression is fully operational and the authorities are seemingly absent, the collective voice of the exploited holds the power to change the world. It is a story that should be taught in every classroom, studied in every law school, and discussed in every corporate boardroom, ensuring that the lessons of the Daegu Apparel compound are never forgotten, and that the vigilance demanded by the survivors remains a constant, active priority for every generation to come. The resilience they showed in the face of absolute despair, their unwavering commitment to the truth, and their ultimate success in achieving a measure of justice that has resonated across the globe. -1 as the most significant, enduring legacy of this entire saga. They are the architects of a safer world, the ones who stood tall when the world was trying to crush them, and their lives serve as a brilliant, unyielding light for all who continue to fight against a scourge of human trafficking in all its terrifying, persistent forms. The path forward, illuminated by the courageous actions of these women, is clear, though it remains incredibly arduous. It necessitates a global, concerted effort to ensure that the standards of human dignity are not treated as flexible variables, but as immutable, non-negotiable requirements for any business entity operating within the international marketplace. It demands an uncompromising commitment to the protection of the most vulnerable, ensuring that no worker is ever again placed in a position where they must rely on the chance discovery of a crumpled piece of paper to signal their desperate need for rescue. The legacy of Daegu Apparel is an invitation to engage in a deeper, more radical form of empathy and empathy that actively seeks out the human stories hidden behind the labels we buy. And that persistently demands that the structures of our economy be rebuilt to reflect our shared, foundational belief in the sanctity of human life. The survivors have performed the most difficult part of this task by surviving and by refusing to be defined by the evil they encountered. It is now our collective responsibility to ensure that their struggle, their suffering, and their ultimate victory are used to build a future where such a case remains not only unthinkable, but physically and legally impossible to replicate. The strength they displayed, even in the depths of their captivity, is a power that continues to move the needle toward justice, proving once and for all that the human spirit, when fueled by the truth, possesses an unstoppable capacity for liberation and for the final, definitive rejection of the dark, dehumanizing shadows of history. In the final analysis, the saga of Daegu Apparel is a mirror held up to ourselves. It forces us to confront the realities of what we accept, what we ignore, and what we are willing to change in our pursuit of a world that is truly equitable. The legal outcomes, the legislative shifts, and the personal triumphs of the survivors are all significant markers of progress, but they are also markers of how much work remains to be done. We live in an era where the demand for constant growth and efficiency often overrides the slow, messy, and infinitely more important work of protecting human rights. The memory of the women who suffered at the hands of Kil Suli is a constant, necessary correction to this perspective, a reminder that every product we consume has a history. And that history must be one of dignity, not of chains. Their legacy is not static. It is a living, ongoing dialogue that requires each of us to participate in the dismantling of exploitation wherever it may exist. By keeping their story alive, by honoring the courage they displayed, and by ensuring that their victory is never minimized or forgotten, we participate in the broader, eternal mission to protect the humanity of every individual on this planet. The darkness they endured was extreme, but the light they have collectively generated through their persistence, their truth, and their strength remains a powerful guiding star for all who strive for a future defined by liberty, justice, and the unwavering, fundamental respect for every single human life, regardless of the barriers, the borders, or the corporate interests that may seek to stand in our way. The enduring narrative of Daegu apparel occupies a singular, chilling space in the annals of American labor history, serving as a permanent scar that reminds us of the fragility of human rights when placed under the relentless pressure of unrestrained global commerce. While the preceding chapters of this investigation have meticulously detailed the criminal mechanisms of Kill Suli, the harrowing reality of the survivor's captivity, and the profound legal repercussions that dismantled his regime, the final evaluation of this tragedy must look beyond the verdict and the legislation. It must instead focus on the enduring, transformative power of the survivor's voices, a force that remains the most potent weapon against the continued existence of modern slavery. As we reflect upon the legacy of this case, we are confronted with the undeniable reality that the fight against exploitation is not a static endeavor. It is an ongoing, fluid struggle that adapts to the shifting landscapes of global supply chains and the evolving tactics of those who seek to profit from the misery of others. The survivors, through their deliberate choice to emerge from the silence of their trauma, have fundamentally altered the landscape of accountability. They have moved from being nameless, faceless variables in a criminal enterprise to becoming the articulate, determined narrators of their own liberation. This shift is not merely symbolic. It is a vital, functional component of the anti-trafficking movement. By humanizing the statistics and grounding the abstract discussions of labor violations in the visceral, undeniable reality of lived experience, they have made it increasingly difficult for corporate entities and governmental bodies to turn a blind eye to the realities occurring within their jurisdictions. The lessons extracted from the Daegu disaster have also necessitated a fundamental rethinking of the role of the American consumer in the global marketplace. For too long, the distance between the retail shelf and the production floor was treated as an impenetrable barrier, an abstraction that allowed the consumer to remain entirely insulated from the ethical costs of their choices. The Daegu case obliterated this distance. It forced a direct, uncomfortable confrontation with the fact that the clothing worn by millions of people across the United States was, in some instances, stitched together by individuals who were enduring the very antithesis of the liberties that the country purports to champion. This confrontation has catalyzed a growing, persistent movement toward radical transparency. It has empowered activists to demand that corporations provide detailed, verifiable documentation of the conditions in their factories, moving the conversation from performative corporate social responsibility initiatives to the rigorous, enforceable standards of supply chain ethics. The legacy of the Daegu survivors is inextricably linked to this progress. They provided the necessary moral leverage to hold corporations accountable for the actions of their most remote subcontractors. They turned the invisible, hidden costs of the fast fashion economy into a public, undeniable issue that can no longer be relegated to the shadows. Furthermore, the Daegu apparel case serves as a permanent, critical warning regarding the dangerous intersection of isolation and lack of oversight in offshore territories. The geographical separation of American Samoa from the mainland was not merely a logistical factor. It was a key component of the criminal design, a tactical advantage that allowed Kill Suli to operate with an aura of invulnerability that would have been entirely untenable in the proximity of mainland federal law enforcement. This case forced a critical, structural change in how the United States approaches the governance and oversight of its remote territories, mandating that the protection of fundamental human rights must be enforced with the same absolute rigor in every corner of the jurisdiction, regardless of physical distance. It established a principle that the reach of the law is not limited by the expanse of the ocean, and that the federal government bears an unshakable, proactive responsibility to ensure that no individual living under the American flag is subjected to the horrors of involuntary servitude. This recognition has been essential in refining the surveillance and enforcement strategies of agencies like the Department of Justice. which now utilize the hard-learned lessons from this tragedy to better identify and neutralize emerging threats in similarly isolated or unregulated environments before they can metastasize into larger, more devastating catastrophes. The emotional and psychological journey of the survivors continues to be the most vital, resonant aspect of this narrative. It is a journey that defies the reductive labels often imposed upon them by a justice system that is frequently more concerned with the success of a prosecution than the long-term healing of a victim. They have shown that recovery is not a destination characterized by the erasure of the past, but a continuous, deeply courageous process of integrating the trauma into a life that is defined by new meaning and renewed agency. Their refusal to be defined by their victimhood is perhaps their most radical act of defiance. They have built lives characterized by stability, community, and the pursuit of individual fulfillment, thereby asserting their identity as human beings who deserve to be recognized for their resilience rather than their suffering. Their stories are a testament to the fact that the capacity for human recovery is profound, and that when supported by genuine resources and the protection of the law, individuals who have been pushed to the absolute edge of existence are capable of returning to inhabit the world with purpose and profound dignity. This is the ultimate triumph that Sully, in his pursuit of total control, could never have predicted or prevented. The ability of the human spirit to transcend the cruelest of physical environments and reclaim its inherent, unshakable worth. As we conclude this detailed examination of the Daegu Apparel tragedy, we are left with the imperative to ensure that the memory of what happened in Tafuna remains an active, shaping force in our collective moral conscience. It is not enough to simply recount the horror. We must actively utilize the understanding gained from this case to build a future that is fundamentally more protective and more aware of the realities of global labor. This requires a persistent, unyielding commitment from every one of us to remain skeptical of the narratives provided by those who profit from global trade, and to demand that our economic systems be designed to uphold, rather than undermine, the fundamental dignity of the human person. The survivors have performed their part of this work with a bravery that is truly humbling. They have provided us with the truth, and they have provided us with the evidence that a change in the status quo is both necessary and achievable. The responsibility now rests with us to carry this truth forward, to ensure that the gates of Daegu Apparel stay permanently closed, and that the silence they broke through their courage continues to be filled with the voices of those who demand a world where every single individual is treated as an end in themselves, never merely as a means to an economic end. The legacy of the Daegu Apparel case is finally and fundamentally one of awakening. It was an awakening for the federal authorities who had to rethink their jurisdictional oversight. An awakening for the major retail corporations who had to grapple with the reality of their supply chain negligence. An awakening for the American consumer who had to confront the reality behind the Made in USA label. And most importantly, an awakening for the global community to the persistence of modern slavery in the most unexpected and seemingly legitimate of places. It serves as a permanent, vigilant guard against the return of such unchecked, predatory practices. The work of eradicating human trafficking is, as the survivors have demonstrated through their own lived experience, a generational project that requires the same level of commitment, persistence, and courage that they showed in their own path toward liberation. Their story is a beacon of justice in an often unjust world, a reminder that the pursuit of a more equitable and compassionate global society is the most fundamental, necessary work of our time. By honoring the resilience of those who survived, and by continuing to fight against the systems that allowed such a tragedy to occur, we ensure that the light they have collectively generated will continue to serve as a beacon for justice, a guard against apathy, and a permanent, resounding rejection of the darkness that Sully once sought to impose upon their lives. The case of Daegu Apparel is a closed legal file, but it remains a living, pulsating human truth that must continue to animate our collective pursuit of a world defined not by the exploitation of the weak, but by the universal, uncompromising protection of every individual's right to live, to work, and to flourish in freedom. As we reflect on this closing, Let the voices of the women who emerged from the compound remain a constant, guiding presence in our efforts to build a more just and vigilant future, ensuring that their past is never permitted to become anyone else's future. The journey from the darkness of the compound to the light of the present is complete for them, but the work they initiated remains our shared, enduring obligation. The conclusion of the Daegu Apparel saga brings us to a final, contemplative assessment of what it truly means to bear witness to systemic evil and the transformative potential of collective justice. Over the course of this exhaustive investigation, we have traversed the dark, claustrophobic corridors of a modern-day slave plantation, analyzed the meticulously crafted mechanisms of industrial extortion, and confronted the visceral, human cost of unchecked corporate greed operating under the thin veil of legitimacy. Yet, as we stand at the threshold of this final reflection, the narrative demands that we move beyond the cold, clinical documentation of crimes and sentences to contemplate the enduring spiritual and moral architecture of liberation. The story of those 200 women is not merely a historical account of federal prosecution. It is a profound, unfolding testament to the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to endure the absolute limits of physical and psychological annihilation and emerge with its core identity not only intact but forged into a new, resilient configuration. Their survival represents a fundamental disruption of the logic of exploitation, a defiant act that reverberated across the global marketplace and effectively forced the world to acknowledge the hidden, horrific cost of its own convenience. The verdict rendered in the Honolulu courtroom was an essential, foundational step in the pursuit of justice, but the true, ultimate success of this narrative lies in the quiet, daily persistence of the women who refuse to let their past define their potential. As we evaluate the broader implications of this case for our contemporary society, we must confront the persistent reality that the conditions which facilitated the rise of Kill Suli's empire, namely the systemic vulnerability of migrant workers, the lack of rigorous oversight in peripheral jurisdictions, and the relentless, often unthinking demand for cheap consumer goods have not been eradicated. They have merely shifted, evolved, and concealed themselves more effectively within the complex, labyrinthine structures of our globalized economy. The Daegu Apparel case serves as an indispensable, permanent warning that vigilance cannot be a temporary state or a periodic reaction to scandal. It must be an active, integral component of our global identity. We are collectively responsible for the conditions under which our daily commodities are manufactured. And this responsibility is not met by the occasional expression of outrage or the passive consumption of news regarding human rights violations. It requires a fundamental shift in our economic values, a commitment to prioritize the sanctity of the laborer over the optimization of profit margins, and a willingness to accept the inherent costs associated with an ethical and transparent supply chain. The survivors, through their extraordinary sacrifice, have provided us with the roadmap for this shift, demonstrating that transparency and justice are not merely abstract ideals, but essential, tangible requirements for a functioning global civilization. The legal and legislative legacy left behind by this tragedy, while significant, should be viewed as a starting point rather than a final achievement. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the subsequent shifts in jurisdictional enforcement have created critical, essential barriers against the recurrence of such industrial atrocities. Yet they remain susceptible to the eroding forces of political indifference and corporate lobbying. The resilience of the survivors is a call to action, demanding that we protect and strengthen these hard-won protections against any attempt to weaken their efficacy. We must remain perpetually wary of the voices that argue for the necessity of deregulation in the name of economic efficiency, for it is precisely within these deregulated and monitored spaces that the seeds of modern slavery are most effectively sown. The Daegu case serves as the definitive, historical counterargument to such rhetoric, providing clear, irrefutable evidence that when labor protections are stripped away, the result is not economic growth but the systematic dehumanization of the vulnerable. It reminds us that the law is not a static protector of rights, but a dynamic instrument that must be continuously championed and defended by an informed, active, and deeply empathetic citizenry. Looking toward the future, the influence of this case continues to shape the strategies of international human rights organizations and the ethical standards of global industry. The emergence of rigorous, independent auditing protocols and the increasing demand for end-to-end supply chain visibility can be directly traced to the public scrutiny ignited by the discovery of the Daegu compound. We are witnessing a slow, albeit consistent, movement toward a marketplace where the ethical origin of a product is as highly valued as its utility. A marketplace where the exploitation of labor is not merely a reputational risk, but a definitive, disqualifying failure. This movement is the ultimate legacy of the 200 women who broke their silence in 1999. Their courage provided the initial, crucial impulse for this transformation, and their ongoing endurance serves as the primary inspiration for those who continue to work in the shadows of the global supply chain, fighting for the recognition of their fundamental rights. By continuing to tell their story, by analyzing the systemic failures that enabled their suffering, and by persistently demanding that corporations and governments adhere to the highest standards of human dignity, we participate in their ongoing journey toward absolute liberation. We ensure that their past, once characterized by the darkest, most oppressive shadows, is forever repurposed as a beacon for the light of global human rights. The final, most profound lesson of this entire endeavor is perhaps the most difficult for us to fully internalize: the recognition of our own profound interconnection. In the interconnected web of modern trade, the suffering of an individual in a remote island factory is not an isolated event occurring in a vacuum. It is a manifestation of the structural choices we collectively make every day as participants in the global economy. The Daegu apparel saga shatters the comforting illusion of separation, forcing us to acknowledge that our lives are deeply, irrevocably linked to the lives of those whose labor sustains us. When we embrace this reality, the pursuit of justice for the exploited ceases to be a distant, charitable act and becomes an urgent, necessary step toward the healing of our own global society. It is a pursuit that demands the dismantling of the apathy that permits such horrors to persist, and the construction of an economic and political order that prioritizes the welfare of the collective over the greed of the individual. This is the profound, resonant challenge that the Daegu survivors have issued to us through their lived experience, a challenge that we must meet with the same unwavering, steadfast courage they demonstrated throughout the most agonizing ordeal of their lives. In reflecting upon this final chapter, we must also honor the quiet, private dignity of the survivors as they continue to lead lives that are defined not by their past trauma, but by their future promise. Their ability to find solace, to build communities, and to pursue the milestones of a peaceful life is a testament to the fact that while cruelty can cause monumental damage, it is fundamentally incapable of destroying the essence of the human spirit. Their lives are the most vibrant, essential evidence that the world is worth fighting for, and that the fight itself, despite the immense weight of the challenges it presents, is a pursuit that bestows profound meaning and connection upon those who undertake it. As we conclude this intensive exploration of the Daegu apparel tragedy, let us do so with a renewed, sharpened sense of purpose. Let us carry forward the memory of their struggle as a guidepost for our own commitment to justice, ensuring that the lessons of Tafuna are never lost to time, but remain an active, animating force in our pursuit of a world where exploitation has no place, and where the dignity of every human being is recognized, protected, and celebrated as the foundational principle of our global existence. The story of the 200 women is not a closed book. It is a living truth, a constant, necessary call to act with courage, with empathy, and with an unyielding commitment to the universal realization of human freedom. We are, in the end, defined by what we choose to remember and what we choose to carry forward from the deep, often uncomfortable history of our world. The story of Daegu apparel is a foundational narrative for our modern understanding of labor rights, and it is a narrative that must be continuously re-examined, refined, and upheld against the erosion of forgetfulness. It is a story that requires us to be more than just observers of the historical arc. It requires us to be its conscious architects, ensuring that it bends inexorably toward justice, compassion, and the fundamental recognition of our shared humanity. By carrying forward the lessons of this case, by honoring the resilience of those who survived, and by remaining eternally vigilant against the recurrence of the darkness they faced, we contribute to a global legacy that transcends borders, ideologies, and corporate interests. We commit ourselves to the creation of a future where the darkness of Tafuna serves not as a precedent for our current failures, but as a definitive, ancient reminder of the depths from which we have collectively emerged and the heights toward which we must continue to strive. The work of liberation is the work of every generation, and it is a work that finds its most profound, enduring inspiration in the lives of those who refuse to be broken, who refuse to be silenced, and who ultimately showed us that the light of the human spirit, when joined with the truth, is an invincible force that will forever transcend even the most sophisticated and brutal instruments of oppression ever designed by the human mind. The final chapter of this investigation is not an end, but a solemn, collective commitment to remain awake, to remain engaged, and to remain steadfast in the belief that a truly free world is not only possible, but is the only world worthy of our continued investment, our deepest efforts, and our unwavering, collective love for the inherent, unshakable worth of every individual. The conclusion of this exhaustive investigation into the Daegu apparel tragedy brings us to a final reflection on the nature of systemic memory and the moral imperative of remembrance. As we step back from the granular details of the factory floor, the brutal, sand-filled pipes, and the complex legal maneuverings of the Honolulu courtroom, we are left to contemplate the permanent transformation that this case has imprinted upon the collective conscience of those who bear witness to it. The survivors, in their journey from the silence of absolute enslavement to the articulate, empowered assertion of their own truth, have fundamentally reshaped the way we understand the relationship between individual resilience and systemic accountability. Their legacy is not found in the crumbling concrete of a repurposed building or the archived records of a federal trial, but in the vibrant, ongoing insistence that no human life is ever disposable, and that the mechanisms of global trade must be held to a standard that recognizes this immutable truth. As the years continue to recede from the events of November 1999, the urgency of this case remains undiminished, serving as a vital, necessary alarm for a world that often seeks to bury its darkest contradictions beneath the superficial veneer of economic growth and technological progress. We are reminded, with every retelling of this story, that the structural weaknesses that allowed the Tafuna compound to exist are collective apathy, the insulation provided by complex corporate hierarchies, and the persistent devaluation of marginalized labor are not ghosts of the past, but living risks that require our active, vigilant opposition in the present. The act of remembering is, in itself, a profound form of resistance against the dehumanizing forces that the kill Suli sought to operationalize. By refusing to let the names and the stories of the Daegu workers fade into the background of historical data, we actively participate in the ongoing work of their liberation. We transform their suffering from a private, agonizing ordeal into a public, instructive truth that challenges the status quo and demands a higher degree of ethical engagement from all who participate in the global economy. This memorializing function is essential. It provides the moral ballast that keeps our societal compass pointed toward justice, ensuring that the progress we achieve is built upon a foundation of truth rather than the convenient amnesia of the powerful. The survivors have, through their immense individual courage, provided the materials for this monument of truth, and it is now our collective, enduring responsibility to maintain it, to interpret it, and to apply its lessons to the emerging challenges of our contemporary world. We find that the most significant transformation is not external, but internal, a shift in our own perception of the world that rejects the ease of ignorance and embraces the often uncomfortable, burdensome, but infinitely more rewarding reality of moral responsibility. We are no longer mere consumers of the global marketplace. We are, through the witness of this case, its conscious, ethical, and proactive stewards. In contemplating the final, indelible impact of the Daegu apparel saga, we must also acknowledge the fragile beauty of the lives that have been rebuilt from the wreckage. The survivors' current existence, defined by the quiet pursuit of community, family, and independent fulfillment, is perhaps the most profound rebuke to the ideology of total control that Lee attempted to impose. The fact that they have flourished, despite the monumental physical and psychological trauma they endured, is a testament to the fact that the human capacity for growth is not only resilient but fundamentally expansive. They have not merely returned to the world they once knew. They have built an entirely new world that is reflective of their hard-won autonomy and their deep, nuanced understanding of what freedom truly demands. This realization is both a comfort and a call to action. It confirms the inherent strength of the individual, but it also reminds us that this strength must be supported by a society that values the protection of the vulnerable over the optimization of capital. Their success is a shared victory, a proof of concept for the anti-trafficking movement that demonstrates that when survivors are treated with the dignity and provided with the resources they deserve, they are not only capable of recovery but are uniquely positioned to lead the fight for the liberation of others. Looking forward, the Daegu Apparel case must continue to function as a cornerstone of our pedagogical efforts in the fields of labor ethics, international human rights, and corporate responsibility. It should be the definitive narrative that challenges the naive assumptions of the free market, illustrating that without rigorous, uncompromising, and transparent oversight, the pursuit of profit is capable of spiraling into the most profound and visceral forms of human degradation. Educators, policymakers, and industry leaders must engage with this narrative not as a peripheral, tragic anomaly, but as a central, instructive case that illuminates the potential for institutional failure in every corner of the global economy. By integrating the lessons of Tafuna into the foundational training of future professionals, we cultivate a generation of leaders who are structurally and ethically incapable of ignoring the human cost of their decisions. We move toward a future where the question of how was this produced is not an afterthought, but a primary, non-negotiable requirement for the legitimacy of any product, service, or business model. The survivors of Daegu have already paid the cost of our education. It is now incumbent upon us to ensure that this education is universally applied and never again relegated to the shadows of historical indifference. Furthermore, we must recognize that the fight against human trafficking is an infinite game, one that requires a consistent, multidimensional strategy that addresses the socioeconomic root causes of exploitation, the technological gaps in surveillance and detection, and the profound, systemic inequities that force millions of individuals into situations of extreme vulnerability. The Daegu Apparel case provides us with the blueprint for a coordinated, effective response, but the execution of this response must be continuous and dynamic. We must support the NGOs and community organizations that work directly with the survivors, providing them with the necessary funding and institutional backing to carry out their essential, life-saving work. We must demand that our elected representatives enact legislation that is not only robust on paper, but effectively implemented on the ground, with the resources to ensure that the promise of protection is a reality for every individual regardless of their location. Most importantly, we must maintain a personal, unwavering commitment to transparency, questioning the hidden narratives of our own consumption and demanding that the corporations we engage with are held to the highest standard of human rights. This is the ultimate, practical application of the lessons of the Daegu Apparel case, a commitment that transcends rhetoric and manifests in the deliberate, conscious choices we make every day of our lives. The final evaluation of this investigation leaves us with a sense of profound, dual responsibility. We carry the weight of the past, characterized by the darkness of the compound and the resilience of those who survived it, and we carry the promise of the future, characterized by our collective capacity to build a world that is fundamentally and unyieldingly free from the scourge of exploitation. The Daegu survivors have done their part, and their endurance has provided us with the necessary, piercing light to identify and dismantle the systems of oppression that surround us. As we close this chapter, let us resolve to remain vigilant, to remain compassionate, and to remain fundamentally committed to the belief that the light of human dignity, once ignited by the truth, can never be extinguished. The story of the 200 women is a call to be more than just spectators in the face of human suffering. It is a command to participate, to advocate, and to protect the humanity of every individual on this planet. Let their resilience be the foundation upon which we build a world that finally, definitively fulfills the promise of universal freedom, a world where the darkness of Tafuna serves as a distant, ancient reminder of how far we have come, and where the light of our shared commitment ensures that such a tragedy can never, under any circumstances, be repeated. The closing of this file is not a departure from the truth, but a deepening of our commitment to it, a transition from the documentation of a single, horrific crime to the broader, ongoing mission of building a global order that honors the inherent worth of every person. In this, the legacy of the Daegu apparel case finds its most perfect and enduring realization, transcending the boundaries of its origin and becoming a permanent, vital component of our shared, universal pursuit of justice, liberty, and the unyielding respect for the inherent, unshakable dignity of every human being. The journey, though fraught with the shadows of the past, points toward a future that is brighter, more transparent, and more radically human than any we have yet known, provided we are willing to do the necessary, difficult, and profoundly rewarding work of making that future a reality.